Night settles gently over Washington, D.C., and from a distance the city appears calm, almost ceremonial. The marble monuments glow softly under carefully placed lights, streets sweep past government buildings in orderly lines, and the Potomac moves without urgency, reflecting a capital that presents itself as stable and powerful. For many, this is a city of speeches, laws, and history preserved behind glass. But in the early 1990s, beneath that polished surface, another Washington existed, one rarely photographed, rarely acknowledged, yet deeply felt by those who lived within it. This was a city where power did not wear suits, where authority was not granted by election, and where fear traveled faster than any official decree. In certain neighborhoods, the night carried a different kind of energy. Streetlights flickered instead of shone, their weak glow stretching long shadows across cracked sidewalks. Sirens were not interruptions here, they were part of the rhythm, as familiar as passing cars or distant voices. Conversations happened in low tones, not out of courtesy, but out of instinct. Names were spoken carefully, if at all. And among those names, one in particular carried weight, Anthony Jones. Not a politician, not a celebrity, not a man whose face appeared on the evening news. Yet in the streets of Washington, D.C., his presence was known, his reputation felt long before he entered a room. To understand Anthony Jones, it helps to first understand the silence that surrounded him. This was not the loud, theatrical power of movie gangsters or headline-hungry crime bosses. It was quieter, more controlled, and in many ways more unsettling. People did not boast about knowing him. They did not tell stories casually. Instead, his name surfaced in warnings, in unfinished sentences, in subtle changes of tone. A block that suddenly felt tense. A conversation that ended too quickly. A look that suggested it was time to leave. In a city divided sharply by opportunity and neglect, fear became a form of order, and Anthony Jones learned how to shape that fear. The year was 1992, a moment when Washington, D.C., was grappling with one of the most violent periods in its history. The crack cocaine epidemic had reshaped entire neighborhoods, hollowing out families and flooding the streets with desperation and fast money. Homicide rates climbed year after year, and entire sections of the city seemed trapped in a cycle no one knew how to stop. While lawmakers debated policy just miles away, young men learned a different kind of education: how to survive, how to project strength, and how to avoid becoming invisible or expendable. In this environment, power did not come from speeches or titles. It came from presence, from reputation, from the ability to control chaos even as it threatened to consume you. Anthony Jones did not emerge from nowhere. He was a product of this city, shaped by its contradictions and pressures. Long before he was feared, he was simply another figure navigating streets where childhood ended early and choices narrowed quickly. But as the years passed, something about him stood out. Not loud ambition, not reckless violence, but a steady, deliberate approach to control. Where others reacted, he calculated. Where others sought attention, he preferred obscurity. This restraint became part of his mystique. People feared what they could not predict, and Anthony Jones was difficult to read. At night, when the city's official power structures slept, the streets told a different story. Corners functioned like checkpoints, not officially marked but universally understood. Territory mattered. Respect mattered. And mistakes were rarely forgiven. In this world, Anthony Jones' influence grew not through grand gestures, but through consistency. He was said to remember everything: faces, favors, slights. He did not need to raise his voice. Often, he did not need to be present at all. His reputation traveled ahead of him, smoothing some paths and closing others entirely. Yet even at the height of his power, there was something fragile about it. Fear, after all, is a demanding currency. It must be constantly maintained, constantly reinforced. Any sign of weakness invites challenge. Any hesitation invites replacement. This created a quiet tension beneath the surface of Jones' rise. Those closest to him felt it most. Trust became conditional. Loyalty became transactional. The higher he climbed, the fewer people he could truly rely on. Power isolated him long before it protected him. Washington, D.C. itself mirrored this contradiction. A city designed to symbolize unity, yet fractured deeply along racial and economic lines. In wealthier areas, crime was something discussed on the news. In neglected neighborhoods, it was something navigated daily. The distance between these worlds was not measured in miles, but in experience. Anthony Jones operated in the spaces where systems failed, where unofficial rules replaced official ones. To some, he represented danger. To others, he represented order in a place where order was otherwise absent. Both perceptions could exist at the same time, and often did. As 1992 unfolded, pressure began to tighten from all sides. Law enforcement was becoming more strategic, more patient. Rival figures watched closely, waiting for missteps. The streets themselves were changing, growing more unpredictable. Anthony Jones stood at the center of this convergence, a man whose power was real, but whose margin for error was shrinking. Every decision carried more weight than the last. Every silence felt louder. Every night demanded vigilance. This story is not one of sudden explosions or cinematic glamour. It is a slow-burning account of how power forms quietly, how it reshapes those who hold it, and how it inevitably attracts forces that seek to dismantle it. Anthony Jones' name would eventually reach courtrooms and headlines, but before that happened, it lived where history often goes undocumented, in the memories of those who survived, in the habits of neighborhoods that learned to adapt, and in the unspoken understanding that fear, once unleashed, never truly disappears. As the city slept, the streets remained awake, carrying the weight of choices made long before dawn. And in that uneasy space between night and morning, between control and collapse, Anthony Jones' story was already unfolding, whether anyone was ready to listen or not. Before Anthony Jones ever became a name spoken in lowered voices, Washington, D.C. itself was already telling a story of division, neglect, and quiet endurance. In the years leading up to the early 1990s, the city existed in two overlapping realities. One was the Washington seen on postcards and television screens, defined by federal buildings, historic avenues, and the steady machinery of government. The other was less visible but far more immediate to those living within it, a Washington shaped by boarded windows, overcrowded housing, underfunded schools, and streets where opportunity felt distant and abstract. By the late 1980s, the city was in the grip of deep structural problems. Factories that once provided stable employment had disappeared or relocated, leaving behind neighborhoods with few legitimate paths forward. Public services strained under budget shortfalls, and entire communities were left to navigate daily life with minimal support. In many parts of Southeast and Northeast D.C., generations grew up watching promises fade, replaced by survival strategies that had little to do with long-term planning. When systems fail quietly for long enough, informal systems take their place, and those systems often revolve around power, protection, and fear. The crack cocaine epidemic arrived not as a sudden shock, but as an accelerant poured onto existing conditions. What had already been fragile began to fracture rapidly. Crack offered fast money in places where slow money had vanished. For young people facing limited prospects, the drug trade appeared less as a moral crossroads and more as an economic reality. Corners became marketplaces. Apartments turned into distribution points. Violence, once sporadic, became routine. Washington, D.C., would soon earn an unwanted distinction as one of the most dangerous cities in the United States, but behind the statistics were countless individual decisions shaped by desperation and environment. At night, neighborhoods transformed. Streets emptied not because people were resting, but because movement carried risk. Mothers called children inside before dusk. Older residents learned which routes were safer and which to avoid entirely. The sound of gunfire, once shocking, became a grim signal to wait, to stay low, to endure. In this environment, reputation mattered more than documentation. A person's name could protect them or mark them, and word traveled quickly, often faster than law enforcement could respond. Policing during this period was both omnipresent and insufficient. Officers were stretched thin, responding rather than preventing. Trust between residents and law enforcement was fragile at best, broken at worst. Many communities viewed the police not as protectors, but as an external force that arrived after damage was done. This gap created space for unofficial authorities to emerge, figures who enforced their own version of order, often brutally, but predictably. For some residents, predictability, even when violent, felt preferable to chaos. Washington's geography reinforced these divisions. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, separated sometimes by only a few blocks. A short drive could take you from manicured lawns and guarded embassies to streets where infrastructure crumbled and resources were scarce. This proximity intensified resentment and frustration. People could see what they were excluded from, day after day. The city's role as the nation's capital only sharpened the contrast. Laws were written here, speeches delivered here, yet many residents felt unseen by the very systems operating in their backyard. Young men growing up in this Washington absorbed lessons early. They learned which blocks belonged to whom, which gestures signaled respect, and which words could provoke violence. School often competed with the street for authority, and the street frequently won. Not because it offered a better future, but because it offered immediate clarity. Rules were harsh but understandable. Consequences were swift. In places where official institutions felt distant or ineffective, these informal rules shaped behavior more powerfully than any policy. Media coverage of the city during this era tended to flatten these realities into numbers and headlines. Rising homicide rates, drug arrests, gang violence, important facts, but incomplete stories. Rarely did coverage explore the quiet resilience of families who stayed, the elderly residents who remembered safer decades, or the children navigating trauma with little support. The narrative of danger overshadowed the humanity of those living within it. Yet it was precisely this humanity, strained and pressured, that formed the backdrop against which figures like Anthony Jones would emerge. Economic survival blurred into moral compromise for many. Small choices accumulated. Accepting a favor. Running an errand. Standing watch. Each step deeper into the street economy often felt incremental, not catastrophic. The city's environment normalized this progression. When nearly everyone you knew was touched by the drug trade in some way, refusing involvement required resources and options many did not have. This normalization did not make the consequences any less severe, but it made them feel unavoidable. By the early 1990s, Washington, D.C. was tense, exhausted, and watchful. Communities adapted by becoming inward-facing, relying on networks of trust that rarely extended beyond familiar faces. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. Information was currency. Silence was protection. In this atmosphere, power did not announce itself. It settled quietly into routines, habits, and expectations. Those who understood this environment, who could navigate its unwritten rules without drawing unnecessary attention, were positioned to rise. Anthony Jones would come to embody this understanding. But before his story could unfold, the city itself had already laid the foundation. A place where fear and order intertwined. Where survival demanded awareness and restraint. Where the line between victim and participant often blurred. Washington, D.C., before the storm, was not simply a setting, it was an active force, shaping decisions, rewarding certain behaviors, and punishing others with relentless consistency. As the city moved toward 1992, the pressure continued to build. Law enforcement strategies evolved. Federal attention increased. Rivalries hardened. Yet for many residents, daily life remained focused on immediate concerns, getting home safely, keeping children alive, making it through another night. The larger forces at work were felt more than understood. And in the spaces left by neglect and inequality, power continued to reorganize itself, quietly preparing the ground for the rise, and eventual fall, of those who believed they could control it. Anthony Jones' childhood unfolded in a Washington, D.C., that rarely offered stability. Long before his name carried weight on the streets, his world was shaped by uncertainty, by adults stretched thin, and by neighborhoods where danger was not an event but a constant presence. Home was less a sanctuary and more a temporary shelter from whatever waited outside. The walls offered little insulation from the sounds of arguments, sirens, or late-night chaos, and sleep often came in fragments rather than in peace. Family life, like that of many around him, carried its own pressures. Financial strain lingered in the background of everyday conversations, influencing decisions large and small. Adults worked when work was available and worried when it was not. Bills arrived whether money did or not. For a child, these realities translated into a quiet awareness that security was fragile. Dependence on systems that rarely delivered bred skepticism early. Trust became selective. Self-reliance, even when premature, began to feel necessary. The neighborhood itself acted as an informal classroom. Children learned to read the environment with precision, who belonged, who didn't, which corners were safe at certain hours, and which moods signaled danger. Play happened in bursts, constantly interrupted by caution. Laughter could stop abruptly at the sound of raised voices or approaching footsteps. These were not dramatic lessons, but subtle ones, absorbed daily, shaping instinct more than thought. Anthony, like many others, learned to observe before acting, to remain aware of his surroundings at all times. School offered structure, but it competed with the street for influence. Classrooms were often overcrowded, under-resourced, and staffed by educators fighting exhaustion as much as ignorance. Some teachers made a lasting impression, offering moments of encouragement or discipline that hinted at alternative paths. Others simply tried to manage chaos long enough to get through the day. For Anthony, school was neither an escape nor a guarantee. It was another environment to navigate carefully, another place where reputation and perception mattered. Outside of school, older figures loomed large. Teenagers and young adults who seemed to command respect drew attention. They had money when others didn't. They moved with confidence. They were rarely questioned openly. For a child watching from the sidelines, these figures embodied a kind of control absent elsewhere. They appeared immune to the uncertainty that defined everyday life. Anthony noticed this contrast. He noticed who people listened to, who people avoided, and how quickly fear could rearrange behavior. Moments of innocence still existed. Games played in brief windows of calm. Music spilling from open windows on warm evenings. Shared meals stretched to feed more people than planned. These moments mattered, but they were fragile, easily overtaken by reality. Loss visited early, whether through incarceration, violence, or simple disappearance. Adults vanished from routines. Friends moved away or stopped showing up. Each absence reinforced the idea that nothing was permanent. As Anthony grew older, the line between observer and participant blurred. Small tasks, often framed as favors, introduced him to responsibility without protection. Watching a door. Delivering a message. Keeping quiet about what he saw. None of it felt monumental in isolation, but together they formed a pattern. Participation came with rewards, recognition, small amounts of money, a sense of belonging. These rewards filled gaps left by more traditional forms of support. The emotional landscape of this upbringing was complex. Fear existed, but it was not always dominant. More often, there was a low-level tension, a constant readiness. Anger simmered quietly, rarely expressed openly, but felt deeply. There was also pride in surviving, in navigating spaces others avoided, in understanding rules that outsiders misunderstood. Anthony internalized these emotions, learning early that revealing too much could be dangerous. Authority figures outside the neighborhood felt distant and inconsistent. Police interactions were unpredictable, sometimes routine, sometimes aggressive. These encounters reinforced the idea that safety was not guaranteed by uniforms or institutions. Respect had to be earned or enforced locally. This perception shaped how Anthony understood power. It was not abstract or symbolic. It was immediate and personal. As adolescence approached, choices narrowed further. The path of least resistance often led deeper into street life. Not because it promised happiness, but because it offered clarity. Expectations were clear. Rewards were tangible. Consequences, though severe, were known. Compared to the uncertainty of legitimate opportunities, this clarity felt stabilizing. Anthony gravitated toward roles that valued composure, observation, and restraint, traits he had been practicing since childhood. There were moments when alternative futures seemed possible. A conversation with a teacher. A relative's warning. A brief glimpse of life beyond the neighborhood. These moments planted seeds, but they struggled to take root in an environment that demanded immediate survival. Long-term planning felt like a luxury. The present consumed attention. By the time Anthony reached his late teens, the foundation was set. He was not reckless, not impulsive, but deliberate. He understood the importance of reputation, the power of silence, and the danger of appearing weak. These lessons, learned gradually and without ceremony, prepared him for the world he was already entering. His childhood had not forced him into crime in a single moment. Instead, it guided him there through a series of small adaptations, each one logical given the circumstances. This early life did not yet define Anthony Jones as a feared figure. But it shaped the instincts that would later define him: patience, control, and an awareness that power, once gained, had to be guarded constantly. The streets of Washington, D.C., had raised him not with intention, but with consistency, and by the time his story truly began, he already understood the rules better than most. The transition from observer to participant did not happen all at once for Anthony Jones. It unfolded gradually, almost quietly, shaped by circumstance rather than a single defining decision. By the time he began taking his first real steps into the street economy, the environment already felt familiar. He understood the rhythms of the neighborhood, the unspoken codes, and the importance of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. What changed was not his awareness, but his position within that world. Early involvement often came disguised as responsibility. Older figures noticed his calm demeanor, his ability to stay focused without drawing attention. He was reliable in small ways, and in an environment where chaos was common, reliability stood out. Being asked to handle minor tasks carried a sense of validation. It meant he was being trusted, or at least tested. These tasks were rarely framed as dangerous. They were presented as favors, errands, or simple assistance, each one appearing harmless enough on its own. Standing on a corner for a short period. Passing along a message without asking questions. Watching who came and went from a building. These activities required awareness more than aggression, and Anthony excelled at that. He learned to read faces quickly, to notice patterns in movement, to recognize when something felt off. This attention to detail reduced risk and earned quiet approval. With each successful task, expectations grew slightly, and with them, his sense of belonging. Money entered the picture subtly. Not enough to feel transformative, but enough to make a difference. Small bills folded discreetly into his hand. Enough to contribute at home, enough to buy clothes that helped him blend in or stand out as needed. The financial aspect mattered, but it was not the primary draw. More important was the feeling of being useful, of having a role in a system that rewarded competence, however harsh that system might be. As his involvement deepened, Anthony began to notice how power functioned at street level. It was not simply about physical strength or loud intimidation. Those who lasted were the ones who managed perception carefully. They knew when to be visible and when to disappear. They understood that unpredictability created fear, but consistency maintained control. These lessons resonated with Anthony. He gravitated toward figures who embodied restraint rather than impulsiveness, seeing in them a model that felt sustainable. Rivalries existed, but they were often muted, expressed through subtle shifts rather than open conflict. A corner that changed hands quietly. A meeting that ended without agreement. Tension lingered beneath the surface, and everyone felt it. Anthony learned that escalation was rarely spontaneous. It was usually preceded by a series of small signals that only those paying close attention would notice. Recognizing these signals became a form of protection. Trust, he discovered, was always conditional. Alliances formed around convenience rather than loyalty. Conversations were measured. Information was shared selectively. Anthony adapted by revealing little about himself, offering just enough to function within the group without exposing vulnerabilities. This guardedness, developed early, would later become a defining trait. It allowed him to move through different circles without becoming overly dependent on any single one. There were moments of hesitation, brief internal checks when the reality of the path ahead became clear. He saw the consequences faced by others: arrests, injuries, disappearances. These outcomes were not abstract. They happened to people he knew. The risks were evident, but so were the alternatives, or lack thereof. Stability in the conventional sense felt distant and uncertain. The street, for all its dangers, offered structure and recognition now. Anthony's reputation began to form quietly. Not as someone to fear, but as someone to take seriously. He did not talk excessively. He did not seek attention. When asked to handle something, he did so efficiently. When situations grew tense, he remained composed. This composure stood out in a world where fear often triggered rash behavior. Others began to rely on his presence, not for violence, but for steadiness. Over time, his responsibilities expanded. He became involved in decisions rather than just execution. Trusted to assess situations, to advise on timing, to recognize when something was not worth the risk. These moments marked a shift in how he was perceived. He was no longer just participating, he was contributing to strategy. This elevated his status, even as it increased his exposure to danger. Anthony also learned the cost of visibility. Those who flaunted success drew attention from rivals and law enforcement alike. He observed how quickly fortunes could reverse when discretion was abandoned. This reinforced his preference for operating in the background. Power, he concluded, did not need to be seen to be effective. In fact, invisibility often enhanced it. Emotionally, this period was complex. There was pride in advancement, in being trusted with more responsibility. There was also a growing sense of distance from those outside this world. Conversations with family members became more guarded. Friendships shifted as paths diverged. Anthony compartmentalized his life, keeping different aspects separate to avoid conflict. This compartmentalization provided control, but it also fostered isolation. By the time his role in the streets became firmly established, there was no clear moment when he could point to a turning back. The steps had been gradual, each one building on the last. What began as observation had evolved into participation, and participation into influence. He had not sought power openly, but it was beginning to gather around him nonetheless. This phase of his life set the tone for everything that followed. Anthony Jones was learning not just how to survive, but how to operate within a system defined by fear, scarcity, and constant negotiation. The streets were shaping him as much as he was shaping his place within them. And as his confidence grew, so did the expectations of those around him, quietly preparing the ground for a rise that would soon draw far more attention than he ever intended. By the time crack cocaine fully took hold of Washington, D.C., it had transformed more than individual lives, it reshaped the logic of entire neighborhoods. What had once been informal hustles and loosely organized street activity hardened into something more systematic, more efficient, and far more destructive. For Anthony Jones, this shift marked a crucial stage in his development, not because it introduced temptation, but because it revealed how money could reorganize power almost overnight. Crack arrived as a brutally simple equation. Small quantities generated fast returns, and those returns circulated immediately. Cash moved hand to hand, day after day, with a speed that legal work could not match. In neighborhoods where employment opportunities were scarce and wages lagged far behind rising costs of living, this sudden liquidity altered priorities. Survival became transactional. Time horizons shortened. The future mattered less than the next exchange. For those paying attention, it became clear that crack was not just a drug, it was an economy. Anthony observed how this economy rewarded certain traits. Aggression alone was not enough. Those who relied purely on violence burned out quickly or drew attention they could not manage. The ones who endured understood supply, demand, and timing. They managed people as carefully as they managed product. Anthony began to grasp these dynamics instinctively. He saw that the drug trade functioned like a business stripped of formal protections. There were no contracts, no courts, no safety nets. Everything depended on reputation and enforcement. Territory took on new significance. Corners were no longer just places to gather, they were assets. Buildings became strategic positions. Control over a small area could translate into steady income, but only if that control was maintained consistently. Anthony learned that holding territory required more than intimidation. It required predictability. Customers returned to places that felt stable, even if that stability was enforced through fear. Chaos disrupted profit. Money flowed upward through informal hierarchies. Those at the bottom handled volume and risk. Those above them handled organization and protection. Anthony began to move closer to the center of these arrangements, not by demanding authority, but by demonstrating understanding. He recognized inefficiencies. He noticed patterns in police presence. He understood when expansion was worth the risk and when it wasn't. These insights made him valuable. The crack economy also changed social relationships. Friendships blurred into partnerships. Family ties became complicated by money. Loyalty was tested constantly, not through ideology, but through opportunity. Anthony watched how quickly alliances shifted when profit margins tightened. He learned that generosity could build goodwill, but dependence could create resentment. Balancing these forces became part of daily decision-making. Violence, within this system, became procedural rather than emotional. It was not about anger, it was about correction. When rules were broken, responses followed patterns. This normalization of violence was one of the most insidious aspects of the era. Anthony did not revel in it, but he accepted it as a tool embedded in the economy itself. To refuse its use entirely would have been to surrender control. To use it excessively would have been to invite collapse. Learning where to draw that line was critical. Law enforcement pressure intensified as crack spread. Raids became more frequent. Surveillance improved. Arrests climbed. But the economy adapted. Routes shifted. Operations decentralized. Anthony paid close attention to these adaptations. He saw that visibility was a liability. Those who displayed wealth openly often did not last. He adopted a quieter approach, reinvesting resources into people and protection rather than spectacle. The influx of money altered self-perception as well. For the first time, Anthony experienced a sense of agency that extended beyond immediate survival. He could plan, allocate, anticipate. This sense of control was intoxicating in its own way. It reinforced the belief that the streets, for all their danger, offered a form of mastery unavailable elsewhere. Yet beneath this confidence lay constant tension. Every gain increased the stakes. Every expansion narrowed margins for error. Community impact was immediate and devastating. Addiction spread rapidly. Familiar faces disappeared into dependency. Families fractured. Anthony was not immune to witnessing this fallout. He saw how the same economy that provided him leverage was eroding the fabric of the neighborhoods he knew. This awareness created an internal conflict he rarely voiced. Acknowledging it openly would have undermined the logic that justified his participation. Silence became a coping mechanism. As crack profits reshaped Washington streets, competition intensified. New players entered the market, drawn by stories of easy money. Many lacked discipline or patience. Their presence destabilized established arrangements. Anthony responded not with confrontation, but with consolidation. He focused on reliability, tightening operations, reinforcing boundaries. This approach reduced volatility and strengthened his position. Time itself felt different during this period. Days blurred into cycles of activity and vigilance. Sleep was irregular. Trust was provisional. Success was measured not in milestones, but in continuity, another week without disruption, another month without loss. Anthony's life narrowed around these metrics. Other ambitions faded, replaced by the immediate demands of maintaining control within an unforgiving system. The crack era did not simply elevate Anthony Jones, it refined him. It taught him how money could accelerate influence while magnifying risk. It showed him that power, once tied to profit, became both more tangible and more fragile. This understanding would shape every decision he made going forward. The streets of Washington, D.C., were no longer just a backdrop. They had become a marketplace governed by fear, speed, and scarcity, and Anthony Jones was learning how to operate within it with calculated precision. Yet even as his competence grew, so did the unseen costs. Paranoia crept in slowly. Every unfamiliar car prompted scrutiny. Every delayed response raised suspicion. The very skills that elevated him also trapped him in a state of constant alertness. Rest became rare. Peace became abstract. The economy demanded attention at all hours, and it punished complacency without warning. By the early 1990s, the crack-driven transformation of Washington, D.C., was undeniable. Neighborhoods bore the scars. Systems strained. Lives unraveled quietly behind closed doors. Anthony Jones stood at a point where momentum favored him, but the environment itself was becoming increasingly unstable. The same forces that had enabled his rise were beginning to generate pressures that no individual, no matter how disciplined, could fully control. And as the economy tightened its grip on the city, the cost of power continued to rise, one transaction at a time. Reputation in the streets of Washington, D.C., was never built through speeches or declarations. It formed slowly, carried on glances, silences, and stories that traveled without clear origin. By the time Anthony Jones' name began circulating beyond his immediate circles, it was already layered with assumptions. Some saw him as calculated. Others described him as cold. Few claimed to know him well, and that uncertainty became part of his influence. Fear thrives in ambiguity, and Anthony understood this instinctively. Unlike figures who sought dominance through spectacle, he allowed others to talk. Rumors worked in his favor. Each retelling amplified his presence without requiring his involvement. A disagreement that ended quietly. A boundary that was respected without explanation. A situation that never escalated because no one wanted to test him. These moments accumulated into a narrative that felt larger than the man himself. Anthony did not correct exaggerations. He did not deny them either. Silence, he learned, was often more persuasive than confirmation. As his reputation grew, so did the expectations placed upon him. People began to anticipate responses even when none were given. Decisions were made based on what they believed he might do. This indirect control reduced the need for constant enforcement. Fear became self-sustaining. Anthony recognized the efficiency of this dynamic. Maintaining it required discipline, reacting only when necessary, avoiding impulsive displays, and preserving unpredictability. Violence, when it occurred, was precise rather than frequent. This selectivity reinforced his image. It suggested calculation rather than volatility. Those watching understood that he was capable, but not reckless. In an environment saturated with noise and chaos, this restraint distinguished him. It made his actions feel deliberate, and therefore more intimidating. People feared what seemed intentional far more than what seemed emotional. Yet this reputation carried a cost. Fear created distance. Conversations became guarded. People offered information selectively, often withholding as much as they shared. Anthony found himself increasingly isolated, surrounded by individuals who responded to his presence with compliance rather than honesty. Trust eroded subtly. Allies performed loyalty, but sincerity was difficult to measure. Every interaction required evaluation. Every gesture had to be interpreted cautiously. Internally, Anthony felt the weight of maintaining this image. Reputation, once established, demanded consistency. Any deviation risked reinterpretation. Showing leniency could be read as weakness. Showing anger could invite challenge. The margin for authentic expression narrowed. He became a version of himself shaped by others' expectations, performing a role that no longer allowed spontaneity. The city responded to his presence in small ways. People crossed the street to avoid association. Conversations paused when he entered a room. These reactions reinforced his status but also reinforced his separation from ordinary life. Normalcy felt increasingly out of reach. The streets recognized him not as a person, but as a symbol. That transformation, once complete, was difficult to reverse. Rival figures took notice as well. Some tested boundaries indirectly, probing for response. Others chose avoidance, redirecting activity to minimize contact. Anthony's reputation altered the landscape without requiring direct confrontation. This efficiency appealed to him. It aligned with his preference for control without chaos. Yet it also painted a target. Influence attracts scrutiny, and those who benefit from destabilization began to watch closely. Law enforcement, too, became aware. Not necessarily through dramatic incidents, but through patterns. Areas where conflict diminished unexpectedly. Individuals who seemed to exert influence without visible presence. Anthony's low profile complicated investigations, but it also drew attention precisely because it defied expectations. His restraint made him harder to classify, and therefore more interesting. As months passed, Anthony noticed changes within himself. Hyper-awareness became constant. Relaxation felt unsafe. Even moments of solitude were tinged with vigilance. The reputation he had cultivated followed him everywhere, shaping how he moved, how he spoke, how he rested. There was no off switch. Power demanded performance at all times. The psychological burden deepened quietly. Fear, when wielded effectively, must be believed. To ensure belief, Anthony had to embody it consistently. This meant suppressing doubt, empathy, and fatigue. It meant making decisions that reinforced the image, even when alternatives might have felt more humane. The line between strategy and identity blurred. He was no longer simply using fear, he was living inside it. Those closest to him felt this shift most acutely. Conversations became transactional. Emotional exchanges gave way to logistical ones. Anthony's guardedness, once a survival tool, hardened into habit. Relationships narrowed around utility. This protected him from betrayal but also from connection. Loneliness settled in, not as absence of people, but as absence of understanding. The city around him continued to change. Violence ebbed and surged unpredictably. New players emerged. Old ones disappeared. Through it all, Anthony's reputation remained a constant reference point. People measured risk in relation to him. They adjusted behavior accordingly. This influence confirmed his position but also tethered him tightly to the environment that sustained it. By this stage, Anthony Jones had become something more than an individual navigating the streets. He had become a presence that shaped behavior through anticipation rather than action. This was power refined to its most efficient form. But efficiency came with fragility. The entire structure depended on perception. A single misstep, a single misinterpretation, could unravel years of careful cultivation. As night settled over Washington, D.C., Anthony moved through familiar streets with a sense of inevitability. He had built something formidable, but it demanded constant attention. Fear, once released, does not rest. It circulates, grows, and returns to its source. And as his reputation solidified, Anthony found himself increasingly enclosed by the very force that had elevated him, a quiet reminder that power, when built on fear, offers no true refuge. As Anthony Jones' influence expanded, the circle around him grew more defined, not in size but in significance. The people closest to him were not chosen through sentiment or long-standing friendship, but through usefulness, reliability, and restraint. In a world where loyalty could evaporate overnight, he understood that proximity to power had to be managed carefully. Every person allowed close represented both strength and risk, and balancing those forces became a constant, quiet calculation. These alliances rarely formed through formal agreements. They emerged through shared experience, handling pressure together, navigating tense situations without panic, responding predictably when chaos threatened. Anthony valued those who understood silence, who did not ask unnecessary questions, who could operate independently without seeking validation. In return, he offered consistency. Protection, when it mattered. Opportunity, when it made sense. This mutual understanding created bonds that felt solid on the surface, even as underlying fragility remained. Within his circle, roles developed naturally. Some handled logistics, ensuring operations ran smoothly without drawing attention. Others focused on enforcement, not as brute instruments, but as signals. Their presence alone often sufficed. There were also intermediaries, people skilled at communication, who managed interactions with outsiders while insulating Anthony from unnecessary exposure. This structure allowed him to maintain distance while retaining control. Trust, however, was never absolute. Anthony assumed that everyone, given the right incentive, could be compromised. This assumption did not breed paranoia so much as preparedness. He limited the information each person received, compartmentalizing knowledge so no single individual could expose everything. This approach reduced vulnerability but also prevented true collaboration. Even those closest to him operated within boundaries they could not cross. Meetings were understated. Often held in ordinary places, chosen for their lack of distinction. Conversations were brief, efficient, and focused. Emotional language was avoided. Everything was framed in terms of outcomes and contingencies. Anthony set the tone by speaking little, listening more. His silence encouraged others to fill gaps, revealing priorities and concerns. This dynamic reinforced his authority without requiring overt dominance. Yet beneath this controlled environment, tension simmered. Ambition did not disappear simply because it was unspoken. Those within the circle understood the proximity to power they occupied, and with that understanding came temptation. Some sought to expand their influence subtly. Others tested boundaries, pushing just enough to see how Anthony would respond. These maneuvers were rarely dramatic. They unfolded through small decisions, delayed responses, quiet shifts in behavior. Anthony observed these changes carefully. He believed that most betrayals announced themselves long before they occurred, through inconsistency rather than confrontation. A person who spoke too freely. Someone who took initiative without approval. A sudden eagerness to impress. These signs did not prompt immediate reaction. Instead, they were noted, filed away, considered. Response, when it came, was measured. Fear played a role within the inner circle, but it was tempered by dependence. Those closest to Anthony benefited from his protection and his restraint. They understood that instability would cost them as well. This created a fragile equilibrium, sustained not by trust, but by mutual interest. Everyone understood the rules, even if no one spoke them aloud. Outside the circle, alliances were even more fluid. Temporary partnerships formed around specific needs, distribution, access, information. These relationships were transactional and short-lived. Anthony preferred it this way. Limiting emotional investment reduced fallout when arrangements ended. The streets were filled with former partners turned rivals, and he saw no value in adding to that list unnecessarily. Despite his caution, Anthony was not immune to moments of connection. Shared histories with certain individuals created a sense of familiarity that logic alone could not erase. These moments were rare and carefully guarded. Allowing personal feeling to influence decisions introduced unpredictability, and unpredictability threatened control. When conflicts arose between sentiment and strategy, strategy almost always prevailed. As his network expanded, so did the complexity of managing it. Information flowed from multiple directions, often contradictory. Sorting truth from exaggeration required intuition honed over years. Anthony relied on patterns rather than specifics, paying attention to consistency over time. A single report meant little. Repetition signaled reality. The presence of an inner circle also altered how others perceived him. It reinforced the idea that he was insulated, protected, and therefore more dangerous to challenge. This perception discouraged direct confrontation but encouraged indirect efforts to undermine him. Rumors, misinformation, and quiet sabotage became tools used by those unwilling to face him openly. Anthony responded by tightening communication and reducing exposure. Emotionally, this period deepened his isolation. Surrounded by people, he felt increasingly alone. Conversations lacked authenticity. Every interaction carried subtext. The constant need to assess motives drained energy. Rest became superficial. Trust, once tentative, became abstract. The very structure designed to protect him also separated him from genuine connection. As time passed, fractures began to appear. Minor disagreements lingered longer than they should have. Decisions were second-guessed. The pace of operations slowed slightly, not from incompetence, but from caution. Everyone sensed that the environment was becoming more volatile. Law enforcement pressure increased. Rival groups grew more aggressive. The stakes rose. Anthony's response was to double down on control. He reinforced boundaries, clarified expectations, and reduced discretionary authority. This preserved stability in the short term but increased resentment in some quarters. Those who felt constrained began to look elsewhere for opportunity. The circle tightened, even as cracks formed within it. In the quiet hours, Anthony reflected on the nature of loyalty. He understood that fear could enforce obedience, but it could not inspire commitment. Yet alternatives felt risky. Trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability invited loss. The system he had built reflected these contradictions. It functioned, but it demanded constant maintenance. As Washington, D.C., moved deeper into the early 1990s, the balance Anthony maintained grew increasingly delicate. His alliances, once a source of strength, now required vigilant management. Every relationship carried potential consequence. The streets watched, waited, adjusted. And within this network of fragile loyalty, Anthony Jones stood at the center, aware that power shared was power threatened, and power isolated was power exposed. By the time 1992 arrived, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C., felt tighter, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The routines that had once provided a sense of predictability began to fray at the edges. Police presence shifted, sometimes heavy and visible, other times strangely absent. Neighborhoods that had settled into uneasy rhythms found those rhythms disrupted. For Anthony Jones, this year marked a turning point, not because of a single event, but because everything seemed to accelerate at once. Pressure came from multiple directions. Law enforcement strategies evolved, growing more patient and deliberate. Instead of reacting solely to violence, investigators focused on patterns, associations, and long-term cases. Surveillance replaced confrontation. Information was gathered quietly. This shift was subtle, but Anthony felt it. Familiar faces were missing from corners. Conversations ended more abruptly. The streets carried an undercurrent of watchfulness that went beyond the usual caution. Rival groups sensed opportunity in this tightening environment. As competition intensified, smaller players became more reckless, hoping to claim space before it disappeared. This increased volatility unsettled established arrangements. Anthony recognized the danger of escalation. Conflict attracted attention, and attention threatened everything he had built. His instinct was to consolidate rather than expand, to preserve control rather than chase growth. Yet consolidation carried its own risks. Pulling back signaled caution, and caution could be interpreted as weakness. Maintaining balance required constant adjustment. Anthony spent long hours assessing information, weighing reports, considering possibilities. Sleep became fragmented. The mental toll of sustained vigilance accumulated quietly. Every decision felt heavier, each one carrying consequences that extended beyond immediate outcomes. Within his network, tension became more noticeable. People grew anxious. Rumors circulated more frequently. Trust eroded incrementally. Some associates questioned decisions privately. Others sought reassurance through action, pushing boundaries to prove relevance. Anthony responded with restraint, but the effort required to maintain composure increased. His silence, once calming, now felt ominous to those around him. The city itself reflected this unease. Violence spiked in unpredictable bursts. Some nights were eerily quiet, others punctuated by chaos. Emergency lights painted streets in flashes of red and blue. Residents retreated further indoors, limiting movement, shrinking social spaces. The sense of community, already strained, felt brittle. Fear permeated daily life, not as panic, but as expectation. Anthony's role during this period shifted subtly. He spent less time in visible spaces and more time coordinating from a distance. Intermediaries became more active. Meetings shortened. Exposure was minimized. This protected him operationally but deepened his isolation. He experienced the city through reports rather than presence, relying on others' perceptions to guide decisions. Internally, Anthony grappled with conflicting impulses. Part of him recognized that the environment was becoming unsustainable. The pressures converging in 1992 were not temporary. Federal attention, evolving policing, and intensifying competition suggested a future where maintaining control would require greater risk. Another part of him resisted retreat. Stepping back felt like surrendering identity as much as territory. As months passed, cracks in the system became harder to ignore. Small mistakes occurred, missed signals, delayed responses, misunderstandings. None were catastrophic, but together they hinted at erosion. Anthony understood that systems rarely collapse suddenly. They weaken gradually, through accumulated strain. This awareness did not bring clarity, only urgency. Relationships within his circle grew strained. Conversations felt rehearsed. Loyalty, once assumed, now required confirmation. Anthony tested boundaries subtly, observing reactions. Some passed. Others hesitated. These hesitations lingered in his mind, shaping future decisions. Trust, already limited, narrowed further. Law enforcement activity continued its quiet advance. Arrests of peripheral figures disrupted information flow. Safe routines were compromised. Anthony adjusted constantly, but each adjustment reduced stability. Flexibility, once an asset, began to resemble instability. The margin for error shrank. The psychological impact of this period was profound. Constant vigilance eroded patience. The need to project control conflicted with internal uncertainty. Anthony maintained his outward composure, but internally, doubt crept in. Not doubt about his abilities, but about the sustainability of the path he was on. The city offered no pause. Washington, D.C., in 1992 moved relentlessly forward, indifferent to individual struggles. Policies shifted. Resources reallocated. Attention intensified. The streets responded in kind, growing more reactive, more unpredictable. Anthony existed within this feedback loop, both shaping and shaped by it. As the year progressed, the sense of inevitability grew. Not of immediate downfall, but of approaching transition. Something was changing, and no amount of control could halt it entirely. Anthony felt this change in the tightening of routines, in the guardedness of conversations, in the quiet absence of once familiar figures. By the end of 1992, Anthony Jones stood at a crossroads defined not by choice, but by momentum. The structures that had supported his rise were under strain. The environment demanded adaptation, yet adaptation carried risk. Power, once expansive, now felt constrictive. The streets, once navigable, now felt crowded with unseen pressures. This year did not end his influence, but it reshaped it. It marked the moment when maintaining control required more effort than gaining it ever had. The calm precision that had defined his ascent now faced constant challenge. And as Washington, D.C., continued its uneasy march through one of its most turbulent eras, Anthony Jones remained at the center of a tightening circle, aware that the forces converging around him were growing stronger, more patient, and increasingly unforgiving. As the pressures of the early 1990s intensified, violence in Washington, D.C., began to take on a colder, more methodical character. What had once erupted in bursts of anger or retaliation slowly evolved into something closer to policy. Decisions were made not in the heat of emotion, but in moments of calculated stillness. For Anthony Jones, this shift marked a grim turning point. Violence was no longer simply a response to threat, it became an instrument used to preserve structure in an increasingly unstable environment. Anthony understood that fear, when applied selectively, could regulate behavior more efficiently than constant force. Too much violence attracted attention and bred resentment. Too little invited challenge. Maintaining this balance required discipline and emotional distance. He learned to detach action from feeling, to treat decisions as necessary corrections rather than personal acts. This detachment was not innate, it was cultivated over time, reinforced by the realities of the streets. Those around him adapted to this new normal. Enforcement became quieter, more precise. Messages were delivered indirectly. Warnings were implied rather than spoken. The absence of chaos signaled control more effectively than displays of dominance ever could. People learned to anticipate consequences without needing to witness them. Fear settled into routines, shaping behavior subtly but persistently. This procedural approach to violence reshaped Anthony's relationships. Personal grievances were set aside in favor of organizational priorities. Loyalty was evaluated through performance rather than emotion. Those who complied rarely saw consequences. Those who deviated faced swift correction. This clarity reduced uncertainty, but it also stripped interactions of warmth. Human complexity was flattened into categories of usefulness and risk. Internally, Anthony experienced a growing dissonance. The more efficient the system became, the more it demanded emotional suppression. Empathy, once a quiet undercurrent, became a liability. To hesitate was to endanger stability. This realization hardened him. Not through cruelty, but through necessity. The streets rewarded decisiveness, not reflection. The community felt the effects of this shift acutely. Violence, though less visible, was more pervasive. Its threat lingered constantly, shaping daily choices. People avoided certain areas without knowing why. They altered routines instinctively. Children absorbed this tension without explanation. The environment normalized caution to a degree that felt inescapable. Anthony was aware of this impact, even if he did not dwell on it. Acknowledging the broader consequences of his actions threatened to destabilize the internal logic that justified them. Instead, he focused on containment, limiting fallout, minimizing exposure, maintaining order within his sphere. This focus narrowed his world further, reducing complex realities to manageable variables. Law enforcement pressure continued to mount. Investigators noted patterns of restraint and precision, recognizing a level of organization that warranted attention. Anthony's calculated approach made him less visible, but also more intriguing. His ability to suppress chaos suggested control, and control suggested leadership. This perception drew scrutiny. Within his own circle, the normalization of violence created unease. Associates followed directives, but conversations grew quieter. Questions went unasked. The emotional distance Anthony maintained protected his authority but weakened bonds. Trust became procedural, mirroring the system he had built. Everyone understood their role, but few felt secure. Sleep eluded Anthony more frequently. Decisions lingered in his thoughts. Not from regret, but from anticipation. Violence, once employed, generated ripples that required monitoring. Retaliation, law enforcement response, internal reaction, all had to be anticipated. The cognitive load was constant. Rest became fragmented, punctuated by vigilance. The concept of choice itself began to feel constrained. Once violence became embedded as policy, alternatives diminished. The escalation required trust that no longer existed. Compromise risked misinterpretation. The system demanded consistency, even when consistency conflicted with personal inclination. Anthony found himself bound by the very rules he enforced. Over time, the distinction between maintaining order and perpetuating harm blurred. The streets operated with a kind of mechanical efficiency that left little room for reflection. Anthony recognized that the structure he upheld contributed to the suffering around him, but stepping away felt impossible. Responsibility had expanded beyond his capacity to disengage without consequence. This period marked a deepening of isolation. Anthony's identity fused with his role. There was no separation between the man and the system. Fear, once a tool, became an environment he inhabited constantly. Others feared him, but he, too, lived within the boundaries fear created. The city around him mirrored this dynamic. Violence rates fluctuated, but tension remained constant. Residents adapted, developing routines shaped by avoidance and caution. The broader forces driving this environment, policy failures, economic disparity, social neglect, remained largely unaddressed. Individuals like Anthony operated within these forces, both responding to and reinforcing them. As months passed, the long-term consequences of treating violence as policy became clearer. The system functioned, but it consumed emotional resources relentlessly. Relationships frayed. Decision-making narrowed. Creativity vanished. Survival replaced aspiration. Anthony maintained control, but the cost was cumulative. By the end of this phase, fear had become self-perpetuating. It no longer required active reinforcement. The environment carried it forward. Anthony Jones stood at the center of a structure that operated efficiently yet offered no relief. Violence, once a means to an end, had become an end in itself, not through intention, but through inevitability. This realization did not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It settled quietly, like exhaustion. The understanding that maintaining order through fear ensured that fear would never leave. That the system he managed so carefully would continue to demand sacrifices, indefinitely. And as the city moved through its restless nights, Anthony remained vigilant, aware that control achieved through violence could never bring peace, only temporary stability in an unending cycle. As Anthony Jones reached the height of his influence, the weight of it settled heavily on him, often in moments when no one else was watching. Power, as he experienced it, did not feel triumphant or liberating. It felt constricting. The more control he held, the fewer options he perceived. Decisions that once felt strategic now felt obligatory, dictated by the expectations attached to his position rather than by personal intent. Isolation became a constant companion. Surrounded by people, Anthony felt increasingly alone. Conversations revolved around logistics, threats, and contingencies. Rarely did anyone speak freely, and when they did, their words carried caution. He learned to interpret tone and timing as much as content. Even casual remarks were weighed for implication. Trust, already scarce, thinned further as power solidified. The city moved around him, but he experienced it at a distance. Ordinary routines, walking freely, lingering in public spaces, engaging without calculation, felt inaccessible. Every movement required assessment. Every appearance invited interpretation. He became hyper-aware of visibility, choosing when to be seen and when to disappear. This constant self-monitoring eroded any sense of spontaneity. At night, when activity slowed, the solitude intensified. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by thought rather than noise. Decisions replayed endlessly. Outcomes were reviewed, alternatives considered, potential failures anticipated. The mental load was unrelenting. Power demanded foresight at all times, leaving little room for rest. Anthony recognized that authority rooted in fear imposed unique constraints. He could not express doubt or fatigue without undermining his position. Strength had to be projected consistently. This performance became second nature, but it exacted a toll. Emotional suppression became habitual, creating distance not only from others, but from himself. Relationships suffered quietly. Family interactions were strained by absence and secrecy. Old friends drifted away, their lives diverging into spaces Anthony could no longer safely inhabit. New relationships were rare and carefully managed. Intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability felt dangerous. The circle around him functioned, but it did not nurture. The psychological burden manifested physically. Tension settled into his posture. Appetite fluctuated. Restlessness became constant. These symptoms were rarely acknowledged. Admitting strain felt like conceding weakness. Instead, Anthony normalized discomfort, integrating it into daily life. Externally, his reputation continued to shield him. Challenges diminished. Compliance increased. Yet this success reinforced his isolation. The absence of conflict did not bring relief, it heightened awareness of fragility. Stability felt provisional, dependent on perception rather than substance. Anthony began to sense the narrowing of possibility. The path ahead appeared increasingly singular. Retreat risked exposure. Expansion risked collapse. Maintaining the status quo required constant vigilance. The freedom he had sought through power proved illusory. Moments of reflection surfaced unexpectedly. Passing familiar streets triggered memories of earlier years, before influence redefined every interaction. These memories carried a sense of loss rather than nostalgia. The person he had been felt distant, almost unreal. Identity had fused with roles so completely that separation seemed impossible. The city's rhythms continued, indifferent to his internal struggles. Washington, D.C., remained a place of contradictions, order and disorder coexisting uneasily. Anthony occupied a space between these forces, managing tension without resolution. The broader systems shaping his environment remained unchanged, ensuring that individual control could never fully address underlying instability. As time passed, the psychological cost of leadership within this world became undeniable. Decision fatigue set in. Each choice carried potential repercussions that extended far beyond immediate outcomes. The margin for error was minimal. This pressure reinforced caution, slowing action, increasing deliberation. Anthony understood that the crown he wore was not symbolic. It was heavy, tangible, and unforgiving. Power, once attained, demanded maintenance at the expense of peace. He had achieved what many around him desired, yet it offered no refuge from anxiety or doubt. In quieter moments, he contemplated the nature of fear as a foundation for authority. Fear compelled obedience, but it could not inspire loyalty or provide comfort. It isolated both the wielder and the subject. This realization lingered without resolution, a thought without clear application. As the night stretched on, Anthony continued to perform his role, navigating expectations with practiced restraint. The streets responded predictably. Control held. Yet beneath this surface stability, the cost accumulated steadily. Power had granted him influence, but it had also enclosed him within a narrow existence defined by vigilance and restraint. By the end of this phase, Anthony Jones stood alone at the apex of a structure that offered no shelter from its own demands. The crown, once a symbol of achievement, revealed itself as a burden carried in silence. And in that silence, the weight of power pressed down relentlessly, shaping every thought, every decision, every restless night. Betrayal rarely announces itself with noise or confrontation. In the world Anthony Jones inhabited, it arrived quietly, disguised as routine, hidden within subtle shifts that only became visible in hindsight. Long before any open fracture appeared, the foundations of trust had already begun to erode. The system he built depended on alignment of interest, not loyalty of heart, and over time, even aligned interests drifted. The first signs were small and easily dismissed. Delayed responses where immediacy had once been standard. Conversations that felt rehearsed rather than natural. Information that arrived incomplete or too carefully framed. None of these moments alone justified suspicion, but together they formed a pattern that Anthony could not ignore. Experience had taught him that change in behavior often preceded change in allegiance. As pressure from law enforcement and rivals increased, fear spread unevenly through his circle. Some associates responded by becoming more cautious, limiting exposure, minimizing risk. Others reacted by seeking alternatives, quietly exploring options that might offer protection or advantage if circumstances shifted. Anthony understood these impulses, even as he prepared for their consequences. Survival instincts did not require malice, they required opportunity. Information became the most fragile asset. What was shared, with whom, and when took on heightened importance. Anthony reduced the flow, tightening channels, testing reliability. He listened more closely, noting discrepancies. He paid attention to who asked questions and who avoided them. Inconsistency signaled uncertainty, and uncertainty often preceded betrayal. Rumors circulated, rarely traceable to a single source. Whispers about shifting alliances, about external offers, about individuals seeking leverage. Anthony treated these rumors cautiously. Acting too quickly risked confirming fears that might otherwise dissipate. Acting too slowly risked losing control. He balanced observation with restraint, allowing patterns to clarify. The emotional toll of this vigilance was significant. Trust, once conditional, now felt provisional. Every interaction required analysis. Familiar faces became potential liabilities. Anthony's isolation deepened, not from lack of people, but from lack of certainty. Even those who remained loyal were viewed through a lens of doubt. Some betrayals were passive rather than active. Information withheld rather than leaked. Warnings delayed rather than delivered. These omissions could be as damaging as direct action. Anthony recognized that loyalty eroded through neglect as much as through intention. Addressing such erosion required delicacy. Confrontation could accelerate disloyalty. Silence could enable it. In certain cases, betrayal emerged through ambition rather than fear. Individuals who had benefited from proximity to power began to envision themselves as independent actors. They tested boundaries subtly, asserting influence in small ways. Anthony observed these maneuvers carefully. Ambition, he knew, was not inherently disloyal, but unchecked, it threatened stability. The atmosphere within his network grew strained. Conversations became shorter. Jokes disappeared. The easy rhythm of collaboration was replaced by cautious formality. Everyone sensed the shift, even if no one named it. This collective awareness created a feedback loop of suspicion, further weakening bonds. Anthony's responses were measured. He adjusted roles, reallocated responsibilities, limited exposure. These changes were framed as strategic, but their underlying purpose was containment. He sought to reduce vulnerability without provoking reaction. This approach preserved control in the short term but increased resentment in some quarters. Law enforcement presence amplified the stakes. Arrests of peripheral figures disrupted networks, creating gaps that others rushed to fill. These disruptions accelerated realignment, as individuals recalculated risk. Anthony monitored these changes closely, understanding that pressure often forced decisions sooner than planned. Emotionally, Anthony wrestled with conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted clarity, a definitive line that separated ally from adversary. Another part recognized that clarity often arrived too late, after damage was done. He accepted ambiguity as a constant, even as it drained him. As betrayals unfolded, Anthony became more inward-focused. He relied increasingly on his own judgment, reducing dependence on others' input. This self-reliance reinforced his authority but narrowed his perspective. The absence of trusted counsel limited options, making decisions feel heavier. The city around him mirrored this fragmentation. Alliances shifted. Power structures realigned. Stability gave way to flux. Anthony's experience was not unique, but his position magnified its impact. The higher he stood, the more visible each fracture became. Some betrayals eventually surfaced openly, forcing response. These moments were handled with the same restraint that had defined his rise. Public reaction was minimal. Private consequences were decisive. Anthony understood that how betrayal was addressed mattered as much as the betrayal itself. Overreaction signaled insecurity. Underreaction invited repetition. Despite these measures, the sense of inevitability grew. Betrayal, he realized, was not an anomaly but an outcome embedded in the system. Fear-based structures discouraged loyalty and rewarded opportunism. The environment he operated within cultivated these dynamics relentlessly. As time passed, Anthony felt the cumulative weight of suspicion. The mental effort required to sustain vigilance increased. Fatigue set in, not from physical exertion, but from constant assessment. Rest, when it came, was shallow. Trust, when offered, was provisional. By the end of this phase, the illusion of unity had dissolved. Anthony's network continued to function, but cohesion had weakened. The bonds that remained were pragmatic rather than personal. Betrayal had not destroyed his position, but it had reshaped it, narrowing his margins and sharpening his awareness. In the quiet moments between decisions, Anthony acknowledged a truth he had long avoided: the system he had built could never offer certainty. Control could manage risk, but it could not eliminate it. Betrayal was not a failure of character alone, it was a feature of an environment governed by fear and scarcity. And as these realizations settled in, Anthony prepared for the next phase, knowing that the most dangerous shifts often occurred not through open conflict, but through the slow, silent erosion of trust. While the streets of Washington, D.C., operated on urgency and instinct, law enforcement moved according to a very different rhythm. By the early 1990s, the approach to dismantling entrenched street power had shifted away from immediate disruption towards something slower, quieter, and far more patient. For Anthony Jones, this difference in tempo would become one of the most consequential forces working against him, even as it remained largely invisible. Investigators had learned that reactive policing rarely produced lasting results. Arrests made in the heat of violence often removed individuals but left structures intact. New figures filled vacuums quickly. Patterns repeated. By contrast, long-term cases offered the possibility of unraveling entire networks rather than simply trimming their edges. This realization reshaped priorities. Instead of responding to every flare-up, law enforcement began watching, documenting, and waiting. This patience contrasted sharply with street expectations. In Anthony's world, hesitation could be fatal. Delays invited challenge. Action reinforced authority. The idea that someone could afford to wait, to observe without intervening, felt foreign. Yet this was precisely what law enforcement was doing. Surveillance replaced confrontation. Paperwork replaced patrols. Quiet persistence replaced visible force. Anthony sensed increased attention, but it was difficult to define. There were fewer dramatic encounters, fewer overt signs of pressure. Instead, routines felt subtly compromised. Familiar faces disappeared after minor arrests. Questions surfaced during seemingly unrelated stops. Information that once circulated freely now moved unevenly. These disruptions were not random. They reflected a strategy designed to test resilience without revealing intent. Investigators focused on patterns rather than individuals. Who met whom? How often? Under what circumstances? They tracked movement, communication, and association. Each data point alone meant little. Together, they formed narratives. Anthony's disciplined approach reduced obvious exposure, but discipline itself became a pattern. The absence of chaos drew attention as effectively as its presence. The long game required endurance. Cases unfolded over months, sometimes years. Evidence accumulated quietly. Cooperation was encouraged subtly, often through pressure applied at the margins. Peripheral figures, less insulated, faced choices. Some resisted. Others reconsidered loyalties. Anthony understood that law enforcement rarely needed universal cooperation. A few well-placed fractures could destabilize an entire structure. This realization deepened his caution. He limited contact, reduced movement, and relied more heavily on intermediaries. Yet every layer added to protect him introduced new vulnerabilities. Intermediaries could be compromised. Reduced visibility increased reliance on second-hand information. Control became more abstract, more dependent on trust in a shrinking circle. From the law enforcement perspective, this tightening behavior confirmed suspicions. Individuals who adjusted operations strategically signaled leadership. Investigators noted who responded to pressure by reorganizing rather than retreating. Anthony's adaptability distinguished him, even as it increased scrutiny. He was not reacting blindly, he was managing. And management suggested centrality. The emotional contrast between the two worlds was stark. On the streets, tension was immediate and visceral. In offices and briefing rooms, it was analytical and deferred. Investigators reviewed files, compared notes, and planned next steps without urgency. Time was on their side. This asymmetry favored patience over control. Anthony felt the strain of this imbalance. He was accustomed to responding to visible threats. The absence of clear confrontation unsettled him. He could not intimidate surveillance. He could not negotiate with data. The enemy, such as it was, did not reveal itself. This ambiguity eroded confidence, replacing certainty with speculation. As investigations progressed, pressure increased incrementally. Small inconveniences accumulated. Safe spaces became uncertain. Routines required constant revision. Anthony adjusted repeatedly, but each adjustment consumed resources and attention. The system he maintained grew more fragile with every workaround. Law enforcement leveraged predictability. Despite efforts to vary behavior, certain needs could not be eliminated. Meetings had to occur. Communications had to flow. Resources had to move. These necessities created opportunities. Investigators waited for patterns to stabilize before acting, ensuring interventions would yield maximum impact. Anthony's response was to narrow operations further, prioritizing reliability over expansion. This preserved control but limited flexibility. Growth stalled. Opportunities were deferred. The sense of momentum that once defined his rise dissipated. Power shifted from expansion to preservation. Psychologically, the long game exerted profound pressure. Uncertainty replaced immediacy. Threats could not be confronted directly. Anthony found himself anticipating actions that might never come, preparing for scenarios that remained hypothetical. This constant anticipation was exhausting. It demanded vigilance without offering resolution. Within his circle, law enforcement pressure exacerbated existing fractures. Fear intensified. Loyalty wavered. Individuals recalculated risk. Anthony observed these shifts carefully, aware that investigators often relied on internal collapse as much as external evidence. He worked to maintain cohesion, but cohesion under sustained pressure proved elusive. From the outside, little appeared to change. The streets continued their routines. Life moved forward. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet contest unfolded, one defined by endurance rather than force. Anthony's power rested on immediate control. Law enforcement's power rested on time. As months passed, the weight of this realization settled in. Anthony recognized that no amount of discipline could entirely shield him from a system designed to wait him out. His control was active and demanding. Their control was passive and patient. The imbalance was structural. This phase marked a subtle shift in the trajectory of Anthony's story. The streets no longer represented the primary challenge. The true pressure came from an invisible accumulation of attention, an unseen narrative forming beyond his reach. He could manage people. He could manage territory. But managing time proved far more difficult. By the end of this period, Anthony Jones understood that the game had changed. Not in ways that announced themselves loudly, but in ways that narrowed options quietly. Law enforcement's long game did not seek immediate victory. It sought inevitability. And as that inevitability drew closer, Anthony continued to adapt, aware that patience, once his ally, now belonged to those watching from a distance. There comes a point in every structure built on fear when the fear itself begins to lose its sharpness. Not because it disappears, but because people learn how to live around it. For Anthony Jones, this moment arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the environment around him shifted in ways that his usual methods could no longer fully control. The authority he had once exercised effortlessly now required reinforcement, explanation, and repetition. Fear was still present, but it was no longer enough on its own. The first signs appeared in hesitation. Instructions that once moved quickly now met with delays. People sought clarification where none had been needed before. Decisions were questioned quietly, not openly challenged, but filtered through caution and second-guessing. These changes did not erupt into confrontation. They settled into routines, subtly altering the balance of power. Anthony recognized this erosion immediately. Control depended on belief as much as enforcement. When belief wavered, even slightly, the system strained. He responded by tightening expectations, reinforcing boundaries, and making examples when necessary. Yet these responses felt different than before. They lacked the effortless authority that had once defined his presence. Each action required justification, both to others and to himself. Rival figures sensed this shift as well. In environments governed by power, vulnerability attracts attention. Competitors tested edges cautiously, probing for reaction. A disputed corner. A delayed response to an incursion. A conversation that crossed previously respected lines. These tests were small, but cumulative. Each one measured how quickly and decisively Anthony would respond. Law enforcement pressure amplified these dynamics. As external scrutiny increased, internal confidence diminished. Associates grew more risk-averse, reluctant to act decisively without assurance. This caution slowed operations, reducing the immediacy that had once reinforced Anthony's authority. The feedback loop tightened. Slower response suggested weakness. Perceived weakness invited further challenge. Anthony attempted to adapt by emphasizing structure over presence. He delegated more, formalized expectations, and relied on systems rather than intuition. This approach preserved functionality but eroded flexibility. The organization became more rigid, less responsive to nuance. Fear, once fluid, became procedural. And procedure, while predictable, lacked the visceral impact of personal authority. The psychological toll of this transition was heavy. Anthony found himself working harder to achieve the same results. Effort increased while influence plateaued. The sense of inevitability that had once surrounded his decisions faded. Outcomes felt contingent rather than assured. This uncertainty demanded constant attention. Within his inner circle, loyalty became conditional in more visible ways. People complied, but enthusiasm waned. Initiative diminished. Responsibility was deferred upward, increasing Anthony's burden. The concentration of decision-making at the top created bottlenecks, slowing response further. The system, once decentralized through trust, now centralized through necessity. Anthony responded by reinforcing discipline. Expectations were clarified. Consequences were reiterated. Yet each reinforcement carried diminishing returns. Fear, when overused, numbs rather than sharpens. People adjusted psychologically, absorbing threats without altering behavior significantly. Compliance became performative. The city around him reflected this shift. Violence patterns changed. Some areas grew quieter, not from control, but from withdrawal. Others flared unpredictably as new players tested limits. Stability fractured into pockets. Anthony's influence remained significant, but it no longer shaped the entire landscape. It competed. Emotionally, Anthony grappled with frustration. He had built his authority through patience and restraint, yet those qualities now seemed insufficient. Escalation tempted him, but he understood its cost. Increased visibility would invite attention from forces already watching closely. The balance he sought felt increasingly unattainable. This period marked a loss of illusion. Anthony had believed that fear, once established, could sustain itself indefinitely. He now saw its limitations. Fear required renewal. Renewal required action. Action attracted consequences. The cycle accelerated. The most unsettling realization was that his control was no longer exclusive. Others had learned from him. Techniques he once monopolized, restraint, calculation, silence, were now widely practiced. The environment had evolved. His advantage narrowed. Law enforcement's long game intersected with this internal erosion. Investigators noted the changes. Reduced decisiveness. Increased delegation. Fragmentation. These signs suggested strain. Pressure intensified subtly, exploiting moments of hesitation. Anthony adjusted, but each adjustment felt reactive rather than strategic. Sleep became more elusive. Thoughts looped. Plans were revised repeatedly. The confidence that had once anchored him gave way to vigilance without certainty. This internal state seeped outward, influencing decisions in ways he struggled to contain. The collapse of control did not arrive as a dramatic event. It unfolded as a series of compromises. Each one small, each one reasonable in isolation. Together, they shifted the center of gravity away from Anthony. Authority dispersed. Fear diluted. By the time this phase fully settled, Anthony Jones understood that the system he had built was no longer under his exclusive command. It continued to operate, but not at his pace, not entirely by his design. Control, once centralized, now flickered. This realization did not immediately remove him from power, but it altered his relationship to it. He was no longer directing events with confidence. He was managing decline with discipline. The difference was subtle but profound. In the quiet hours, Anthony reflected on the irony. Fear had carried him to the top, but it could not keep him there alone. The streets, adaptive and unforgiving, had absorbed his methods and moved beyond him. And as this understanding settled in, he prepared, consciously or not, for the next stage, one defined not by expansion or control, but by reckoning with the limits of power built on intimidation. The moment of reckoning did not arrive with chaos or spectacle. There were no crowds, no dramatic chase, no sudden collapse of everything Anthony Jones had built. Instead, it came quietly, wrapped in routine, almost indistinguishable from any other day until it was already underway. That was the nature of endings shaped by patience rather than force. By the time the final pressure was applied, the outcome had long been decided. The arrest unfolded with deliberate calm. Early hours, when the city was still suspended between night and morning. Streets empty, air cool, movement minimal. The kind of time chosen not for efficiency alone, but for control. Anthony sensed the shift immediately. Even before words were spoken, the atmosphere told him everything he needed to know. This was not a negotiation. It was not a warning. It was a conclusion. Years of vigilance had conditioned him to respond without panic. His body moved before emotion caught up. Hands visible. Movements measured. No sudden gestures. He had prepared for this possibility in the abstract many times, but preparation did not soften its finality. Control, once so carefully maintained, transferred instantly. The rules changed without announcement. The physical sensations were muted but unforgettable. The subtle weight of restraint. The enforced stillness. The realization that movement now required permission. These details mattered more than any spoken accusation. They marked the transition from authority to custody, from decision-maker to subject. In that moment, the streets receded. Their logic no longer applied. As Anthony was guided through the process, he noticed how ordinary everything felt. The officers were professional, restrained, efficient. There was no visible triumph, no hostility. This was not personal. That realization carried its own weight. His downfall was not the result of a single enemy or betrayal, but of accumulated attention, patient observation, and time. The city outside continued as it always had. Cars passed. Lights changed. Somewhere, people were waking up to routine concerns. The streets he had navigated so carefully did not pause in recognition. That indifference struck deeply. Power, once so consuming, left no visible absence. In the hours that followed, Anthony experienced a strange quiet. Not relief, but a suspension of constant vigilance. The mental noise that had accompanied every waking moment began to fade, replaced by a different kind of pressure. Questions loomed, but answers were deferred. The future narrowed suddenly, defined not by strategy, but by process. As formalities unfolded, Anthony became acutely aware of the contrast between myth and reality. The reputation that had once shaped behavior on the streets carried little weight here. Titles, fear, influence, all dissolved into documentation and procedure. Names were reduced to text. Histories to timelines. Authority to evidence. This transition was disorienting. For years, Anthony had operated in an environment where presence mattered, where perception influenced outcome. Now, outcomes were determined elsewhere, by systems indifferent to demeanor or reputation. The loss of agency was immediate and absolute. Emotion surfaced slowly. Not anger, not despair, but a heavy clarity. The realization that the long game had reached its end. That every adaptation, every precaution, had only delayed, not prevented, this moment. There was no dramatic sense of injustice, only acknowledgement. He had understood the risks from the beginning. Understanding did not eliminate consequence. As days passed, the weight of isolation shifted. In custody, Anthony was alone in a way he had not been before. No network to manage. No decisions to weigh. No reputation to maintain. Silence became unavoidable. In that silence, reflection emerged uninvited. He thought about the choices that had brought him here. Not in terms of regret, but in terms of sequence. One adaptation leading to another. One compromise justifying the next. The path had never felt sudden while he was walking it. Only now did its shape become visible. Outside, the streets adjusted quickly. Others filled gaps. Structures reorganized. The environment that had elevated Anthony proved resilient to his absence. This knowledge arrived through fragments of information, reminders that the system did not depend on any one individual. Power had never been as permanent as it felt. The legal process moved forward methodically. Hearings, discussions, preparations. Each step emphasized distance from the world Anthony had known. Language shifted. Time stretched. Urgency disappeared. The pace favored institutions accustomed to waiting. Anthony observed this process with the same restraint that had once defined his leadership. He listened more than he spoke. He absorbed details. He conserved energy. Yet even this discipline felt different now. It was no longer a tool of control, but a means of endurance. The reckoning extended beyond the courtroom. It unfolded internally, in moments of stillness when distraction was unavailable. Anthony confronted the cost of power not in theory, but in lived experience. The relationships thinned by fear. The identity narrowed by vigilance. The years consumed by maintenance rather than growth. There was no single emotion that defined this period. Instead, there was a layering of acceptance, fatigue, and reflection. The intensity of street life had prepared him for pressure, but not for absence. Without constant demands, time expanded. Thoughts lingered longer. He recognized, perhaps for the first time fully, that the streets had shaped him as much as he had shaped them. That the authority he wielded had been contingent on conditions larger than himself. That control, however disciplined, could not outlast the forces aligned against it indefinitely. The arrest did not erase Anthony Jones' past, but it reframed it. Actions once viewed through the lens of power were now viewed through the lens of consequence. The difference was not moralistic, it was structural. Systems had replaced systems. As the initial shock settled, a quiet resignation took its place. Not surrender, but acknowledgement. The recognition that this chapter had closed, regardless of how carefully it had been written. The reckoning was not dramatic. It was complete. In the end, Anthony understood that his story had never been solely about dominance or fear. It had been about navigation, through environments shaped by scarcity, pressure, and adaptation. The arrest marked the moment when navigation ceased, and the current took over. The streets continued without him. The city remained restless. And Anthony Jones, once defined by motion and control, entered a period defined by stillness, where the only authority left was reflection, and the only certainty was that power, once lost, leaves behind nothing but memory and consequence. The courtroom introduced a world entirely unlike the streets Anthony Jones had navigated for so long. Here, fear and reputation carried little weight. The lessons he had learned on corners, in back rooms, and across alleys, the subtle calculations, the careful silences, the measured use of authority, were rendered largely irrelevant. Decisions were no longer made in the moment, based on perception or instinct. They were mediated by procedure, evidence, and law, each step governed by rules that demanded compliance and consistency from all participants. Anthony entered this environment acutely aware of its contrasts. The courtroom was formal, structured, and slow. Time did not compress in response to urgency. Every motion, every piece of evidence, every testimony moved deliberately, often with pauses that felt interminable compared to the rapid rhythms of street life. Where in the streets a single decision could shape an entire territory, here a single error might be delayed in consequence but magnified in impact. The pace, at first disorienting, required patience that he had rarely needed before. From the outset, he observed the roles others played. Judges, attorneys, clerks, and jurors operated according to codified expectations, not intuition. Lawyers presented strategy as argument, cross-examinations unfolded according to precedent, and evidence was scrutinized repeatedly for relevance and accuracy. In this environment, influence was procedural, not personal. Authority was derived from adherence to protocol rather than physical presence or reputation. Anthony could no longer rely on fear as a tool, he had to contend with formal proof, statements, and record. Witnesses, both for and against him, provided the narrative in measured fragments. Statements were dissected line by line, their meaning debated and challenged. In the streets, perception often carried more weight than fact. Here, fact, carefully documented and corroborated, was paramount. Anthony experienced firsthand the stark difference between the immediacy of street judgment and the deliberative pace of institutional judgment. Power had transformed from instinct to documentation. Even the language used in court felt unfamiliar. Legal terminology compressed complex situations into precise, often sterile, phrasing. Actions that in street terms would be decisive and visible were reduced to dates, times, and categorized behavior. The immediacy of action was replaced by analysis. Intent had to be inferred from recorded events rather than observed demeanor. Anthony, accustomed to reading people rather than documents, had to adjust to a world mediated entirely through paperwork and testimony. Throughout the proceedings, the myth of his reputation met reality in stark contrast. Stories that had circulated in the streets, about decisive authority, quick action, and unchallengeable influence, were examined with skepticism. Exaggeration, hearsay, and rumor were filtered out, leaving only verifiable events. The power he wielded informally held little sway in this formal space. His fearsome image existed outside the courtroom walls; inside, it was subject to scrutiny and often found wanting. This process required Anthony to navigate a new kind of strategy. Control, which had previously been exercised through anticipation and subtle signaling, now depended on guidance from legal counsel and adherence to procedural rules. Timing mattered differently; patience became a resource rather than a limitation. Every response had to be calculated, measured, and legally sound. In this sense, the courtroom demanded discipline of a different order, one that paralleled, but did not replicate, the tactical thinking of street life. Observation became his tool. Anthony watched patterns in questioning, listened for tone and emphasis, and noted inconsistencies in testimony. He understood that the human elements, hesitation, overconfidence, nervousness, could be as revealing as facts themselves. Where street influence relied on perception, courtroom influence relied on interpretation. Subtle signals became clues to potential advantage or risk. The psychological experience was disorienting. Anthony was accustomed to being the one who set the pace, controlled the environment, and managed perception. Here, the pace was set externally, the environment mediated by rules, and perception mediated by facts. His role shifted from executor to respondent, from director to observer. This transition demanded patience, discipline, and acceptance of limits he had rarely confronted before. Associates and former adversaries observed from a distance, their interpretations filtered through their own understanding of street dynamics. Some assumed he would act aggressively, attempt manipulation, or assert dominance. Instead, he adapted silently, relying on counsel, observation, and controlled response. The contrast between expectation and action highlighted the divergence between informal authority and institutional power. The courtroom also forced reflection. Anthony was confronted with the consequences of choices that had been abstract or deferred in the streets. Actions once measured in terms of influence, survival, and reputation were now quantified in terms of legality and culpability. There was a new form of feedback, precise, immutable, and mediated by evidence. This feedback carried weight in a way fear never could, creating a structured reality he had to navigate carefully. The days unfolded with a rhythm entirely different from the streets. Proceedings could be delayed, evidence contested, or testimony rescheduled. This slow accumulation of events contrasted with the immediacy of influence he had known. The patience required was exhausting, yet vital. Anthony's ability to endure this new rhythm became central to his navigation of the system. Despite the restrictions, he recognized opportunities. Moments in questioning allowed for subtle correction or clarification. Patterns in testimony suggested inconsistencies that could be leveraged. Even in a system designed to limit individual influence, acute observation created openings. Adaptation became survival. Authority had to be exercised differently, but it was not entirely absent. The contrast between myth and reality deepened with each proceeding. Tales of decisiveness and omnipotence that had circulated on the streets were dismantled methodically. Some allies struggled with the new truth, surprised by the limits of influence outside familiar territory. Anthony, by contrast, internalized the difference, adapting without hubris or emotional upheaval. The lesson was precise: control outside institutional structures could not be transplanted into them without modification. By the end of this phase, Anthony Jones had navigated the courtroom with a combination of observation, restraint, and adaptation. Power, which had once been measured in fear and response, was now measured in adherence to rules, timing, and comprehension of procedure. The streets and the courtroom operated on fundamentally different logics, and mastery in one did not guarantee success in the other. For Anthony, this contrast was a stark reminder that influence, no matter how formidable, was always contextual. The experience also marked a turning point in self-perception. Authority in the streets had been absolute in its immediacy but fragile in its foundation. Authority in the courtroom was structured and enduring but abstract, contingent on compliance and evidence rather than presence. Anthony learned that navigating both required different faculties: instinct and foresight on one hand, patience and precision on the other. Mastery of one alone was insufficient. In this space, Anthony confronted the limits of personal power. Fear could manipulate behavior, reputation could shape perception, but neither could dictate outcomes in a system governed by law. Influence had to be recalibrated, decisions measured against rules beyond immediate perception, and patience embraced as a form of strategy. The courtroom became a landscape where subtlety, endurance, and interpretation outweighed the tools that had defined his earlier life. This period left a lasting impression. Anthony Jones emerged with a heightened awareness of the distinction between myth and fact, between influence derived from perception and influence derived from systematized authority. The lessons of the courtroom would shape not only how he navigated the immediate consequences of his actions but also how he understood the nature of power itself: structured, constrained, and ultimately dependent on forces larger than any individual. No matter how formidable, prison introduced a reality unlike any Anthony Jones had faced on the streets of Washington, D.C. There, power had been measured in reputation, anticipation, and the careful calibration of fear. In prison, these measures were attenuated and filtered through a structure that demanded obedience and offered control only within very narrow boundaries. The environment was highly regulated, and the rhythms of daily life imposed a constancy that contrasted sharply with the fluidity and immediacy he had once commanded. Every action, every movement, and every word was subject to scrutiny, and the freedom to maneuver that had once defined him was replaced with a new form of constraint. In the first weeks, the psychological impact was striking. Prison walls compressed not only physical space but also time. Days were structured according to schedules imposed externally: wake up, meals, work assignments, counts, and lights out. The rhythm was predictable, almost hypnotic, but it eliminated spontaneity entirely. Anthony, accustomed to gauging and controlling his environment, now confronted a system where adaptation required endurance rather than ingenuity. Decision-making was reduced to compliance or calculated negotiation within limited parameters, and even then, each choice carried consequences. Social dynamics in prison were complex and rigid. Authority operated simultaneously on multiple levels: official rules enforced by correctional staff, informal hierarchies among inmates, and unspoken codes governing behavior. Survival demanded careful navigation of all three. Anthony had to assess who could be trusted, who posed a threat, and who simply moved through the space without attracting notice. Relationships were transactional, alliances formed cautiously, and loyalty was conditional. In this environment, trust could not be assumed, only earned incrementally through observation, consistency, and restraint. The streets, where Anthony had relied on instinct and observation, no longer provided guidance. Here, the logic of survival was different. Power could be demonstrated, but it was fragile. Missteps, misjudgments, or miscommunications could escalate quickly, sometimes violently, and repercussions were immediate. Reputation mattered, but its value was contextual and limited. A fearsome presence on the outside translated imperfectly into influence within these walls. Anthony was compelled to recalibrate not only his behavior but his expectations of control. Isolation became a constant psychological companion. Physical separation from familiar faces and environments was compounded by emotional distancing. Anthony's inner circle, once an extension of his strategy, was dispersed. Communication with the outside world was limited, delayed, and closely monitored. News arrived in fragments. Influence over operations beyond the prison perimeter diminished, replaced by observation rather than action. This forced a new kind of reflection, time without distraction, a period to confront the consequences of previous decisions without the immediate pressure to respond. Routine itself became both a protective mechanism and a source of stress. Predictability offered a framework for endurance, but monotony intensified mental strain. Days were long, and the mind, deprived of external stimulation, began to replay events, decisions, and strategies. Anthony found himself analyzing past actions in detail, considering alternatives, and anticipating outcomes that were now largely hypothetical. This mental rehearsal, while instinctive, carried an emotional weight, as each scenario highlighted both limitations and vulnerabilities he could no longer mitigate actively. Physical adaptation was also necessary. Prison imposed a new set of bodily constraints. Movement was restricted, privacy was minimal, personal space was scarce. Anthony learned quickly that attention to detail, how he carried himself, how he positioned himself in common areas, how he engaged with others, could mean the difference between safety and confrontation. Survival demanded not brute force alone but strategic restraint and keen awareness of subtle social cues. Every gesture, every glance, every word carried significance, and misreading any of them risked escalation. Time itself seemed elastic. Days, weeks, and months stretched and compressed in a rhythm foreign to Anthony. The absence of external crises shifted focus inward. Reflection was unavoidable. He began to confront the consequences of his actions more intimately. Patterns of control, manipulation, and fear that had once served him effectively were now examined against a backdrop of confinement. The skills that had maintained his power on the streets were partially redundant here, compelling him to develop new modes of mental discipline. Observation became central to survival. Anthony watched the behaviors of staff, the alliances among inmates, and the subtle hierarchies that defined influence within each unit. He noted patterns in who wielded informal authority, who avoided conflict, and how respect was communicated without overt confrontation. In this context, subtlety replaced dominance. Influence was demonstrated through attentiveness, consistency, and the careful negotiation of space rather than through fear alone. Communication was carefully calibrated. Words were measured, interactions deliberate. Gossip and misinformation circulated quickly, and perception could rapidly redefine status. Anthony realized that silence could be as powerful as speech, that restraint often conveyed authority more effectively than assertion. Every exchange carried weight, and every misstep could ripple outward unpredictably. The passage of time encouraged reflection on legacy and mortality. Prison imposed a slower rhythm that allowed consideration of long-term consequences that had been obscured in the immediacy of street life. Anthony confronted questions of identity, ethics, and purpose. The man he had been on the streets, the calculated strategist, the feared figure, the central actor, was now constrained by a system that prioritized compliance over ingenuity. This contrast highlighted the fragility of power and the transient nature of influence. Despite the limitations, Anthony adapted. He cultivated routines that balanced vigilance with mental preservation, finding moments of quiet reflection, reading, and observation. He learned to navigate the complex social terrain strategically, maintaining safety while asserting subtle influence where possible. His intelligence, patience, and discipline, traits honed over years on the streets, became tools for endurance rather than control. The experience also reframed his understanding of authority. Outside, fear and reputation had created a form of dominance that required constant maintenance. Inside, dominance was mediated by structure, protocol, and social nuance. Control became less about direct action and more about anticipation, subtle signaling, and psychological management. Success was measured not in territory gained or rivals subdued, but in personal stability, safety, and the ability to navigate each day without incident. Over time, Anthony internalized a new sense of temporal perspective. Months and years were punctuated by counts, meal times, and procedural routines, but the real passage of time was marked by adaptation and endurance. Each decision, each interaction, and each observation contributed incrementally to survival. The stakes remained high, but the metric of success shifted from influence over others to preservation of self within a rigid system. By the end of this phase, Anthony Jones had emerged not only as a survivor but as someone profoundly changed by the constraints of incarceration. The streets, with their immediacy and volatility, had honed his instincts. Prison, with its structure and stillness, honed his patience and observation. The man who once commanded corners and cultivated fear now navigated a world where endurance, subtlety, and measured action defined authority. In this environment, power was no longer an external projection, it was an internal practice, a constant calibration of awareness, restraint, and adaptability, laying the foundation for understanding influence in a way the streets could never teach. After Anthony Jones' absence from the streets became a reality, the neighborhoods he had once navigated and controlled began to adapt. Power vacuums never remain empty for long, and in the world of Washington, D.C.'s street economy, the flow of influence was immediate and relentless. Those who had operated on the periphery of Anthony's authority saw opportunities to expand. Rivals recalibrated their strategies. Former allies reconsidered positions. The city, indifferent to individual presence, continued its own evolution, responding to absence with speed and efficiency. The first shifts were subtle. Patterns of movement changed. Small corners that had once been respected as neutral or under Anthony's protection saw new figures emerge. Transactions that had been deferred now accelerated as entrepreneurs and opportunists sought to exploit the temporary lack of oversight. Some attempted to fill leadership roles, testing the boundaries of territory previously maintained by fear and reputation. These changes often began as quiet adjustments, delivery schedules altered, new alliances formed, minor disputes resolved informally, but collectively, they signaled the reorganization of the street hierarchy. For the community, Anthony's absence was felt unevenly. In some areas, residents experienced relief, particularly where enforcement had been harsh or unpredictable. In other spaces, uncertainty increased as multiple actors vied for control. The equilibrium Anthony had maintained through his reputation and strategic restraint was disrupted, leaving a landscape more reactive than structured. While the streets had adapted to his presence through fear and anticipation, his absence forced adaptation through negotiation, trial, and occasional conflict. Rival figures emerged quickly, often younger and more impulsive than the leaders Anthony had dealt with directly. Their strategies differed, they relied less on subtlety and more on visibility, aggression, and rapid action. The dynamics of influence shifted from anticipatory respect to reactive challenge. These new leaders were untested, which made them both dangerous and fragile. Their assertiveness brought visibility, which invited scrutiny from law enforcement and intergroup conflict alike. As power redistributed, risk became more dispersed but also more unpredictable. Anthony, though removed from immediate operations, monitored these changes through indirect channels. Associates who remained outside prison walls relayed updates, carefully filtered to minimize exposure and preserve their own safety. This flow of information allowed him to assess who was emerging as influential, which rivalries were escalating, and where alliances were forming. However, the lack of direct control over these developments was significant. Patterns that he could once influence immediately now evolved according to forces he could observe but not command. The transformation of the streets highlighted the resilience of systemic dynamics. Anthony's individual power had been formidable, but it had never existed in isolation. The structures he relied upon, alliances, loyalty, territory, and the implicit rules of engagement, continued to function in his absence. Leadership, once centralized through his reputation, dispersed. New actors assumed responsibility for enforcement, negotiation, and conflict resolution. This redistribution did not replicate his style or efficiency, but it sustained continuity. Influence, it seemed, was less about a single person than about the networks and patterns of behavior embedded in the community. Within this shifting landscape, violence remained a tool, though its application became less predictable. New leaders relied on assertiveness and confrontation to cement authority. Conflicts flared in areas where multiple parties attempted simultaneous expansion. The absence of Anthony's steadying hand, which had previously mediated disputes and maintained boundaries through anticipation and subtle signaling, allowed tension to escalate. While this sometimes produced chaos, it also created openings for strategic actors to consolidate gains quickly. Economic activity reflected these changes as well. Transactions that had once been stabilized by Anthony's oversight now fluctuated according to the emerging power dynamics. Prices, availability, and reliability varied more widely. Risk premiums increased as participants sought protection from new authorities or hedged against potential losses from conflict. For residents, this translated into uncertainty and adaptation, as the environment became less predictable. Those who had once relied on Anthony's consistency now had to navigate a more volatile marketplace. Psychologically, Anthony's understanding of these shifts was complex. His absence clarified the distinction between individual power and systemic influence. While his presence had shaped behavior, the mechanisms of the streets, the flow of information, the distribution of resources, and the instinctive enforcement of norms, continued independently. He observed how communities adapted without him, how new actors filled voids, and how cycles of violence and negotiation persisted. This reinforced both the impermanence of individual authority and the enduring resilience of the systems it operates within. Some former allies sought to maintain continuity, attempting to preserve arrangements and practices Anthony had established. Their motivations were mixed: loyalty, self-interest, and fear of instability all played a role. These efforts often prevented immediate collapse, but they could not fully replicate Anthony's strategic foresight. Mistakes occurred, conflicts flared, and the equilibrium that had once been maintained through a combination of observation, patience, and subtle enforcement became fragmented. Meanwhile, rival factions tested boundaries with increasing frequency. They moved decisively into spaces Anthony had once influenced indirectly. Minor confrontations became opportunities to assert dominance. Alliances were renegotiated rapidly. Trust, which had been carefully cultivated under Anthony's oversight, became transactional and contingent. This period illustrated the adaptability of the street environment. Where one node of authority is removed, the network reconfigures itself with remarkable speed. Even the cultural dynamics shifted. Stories of Anthony's reputation circulated, but their impact diminished over time. New narratives emerged, shaped by the actions of those currently active in the streets. Legends gave way to contemporary realities, and influence became a reflection of present capacity rather than past fear. Anthony's myth persisted in memory, but its practical effect on behavior waned. The streets had moved forward, independent of his presence. The combination of opportunity, volatility, and resilience created a complex landscape. Power was contested but distributed. Violence was intermittent but influential. Reputation continued to matter, but it was now earned by current actors rather than inherited from predecessors. Anthony's influence was now mostly observational, dependent on reports and filtered information. He could understand the dynamics but could not enforce them directly. This period underscored a crucial truth: individual power, no matter how formidable, is transient. Systems endure. Networks adapt. Communities respond to absence with their own logic, guided by incentives, norms, and immediate needs. Anthony Jones' removal from active participation did not collapse the street economy, it simply redistributed authority, allowing new figures to rise and old structures to persist in altered form. By the time a full cycle of adaptation had occurred, the streets had reorganized. Patterns of control, conflict, and commerce had shifted to reflect the new reality. Anthony observed these changes from a distance, understanding that his personal role had diminished, but that the ecosystem he had once navigated remained robust. The lessons were clear: power is temporary, influence is conditional, and the forces shaping communities operate independently of any single individual. The streets endure, and while personalities may rise and fall, the mechanisms that sustain life within them persist, ready to adapt to the next change in circumstance. The legacy of Anthony Jones did not manifest in grand monuments or public accolades, nor did it appear in news headlines that celebrated triumph. Instead, it lingered quietly, carried through whispers, fragmented stories, and the cautious recognition of those who had lived within the shadow of his presence. The streets remembered him differently than the city at large. To some, he was a figure of fear, a name associated with control and consequence. To others, he was a form of stability, a paradoxical protector in an environment defined by uncertainty. His legacy was neither singular nor uniform, it existed in layers, shaped as much by perception as by fact. Stories about Anthony circulated unevenly. Some narratives exaggerated his reach, portraying him as omnipresent, as though every corner he had once walked belonged to him still. Others minimized his influence, reframing him as just one of many players in a landscape that had always been competitive and volatile. The truth was more nuanced. His power had been significant, but it had been contingent on his strategic understanding of the streets, his ability to command respect, and the careful maintenance of relationships. Once removed from that environment, the structural forces he had navigated continued without him, demonstrating both the durability of the system and the impermanence of individual control. The duality of fear and respect defined how people remembered him. For some residents, Anthony's presence had been a deterrent to chaos. Corners he controlled rarely erupted into unnecessary conflict. Disputes were contained, threats measured, and expectations understood. In this sense, fear functioned as a form of order. Yet, for others, that same fear had been suffocating, a constant reminder of the consequences of missteps. People lived with the knowledge that a single wrong glance, word, or action could invoke retaliation. The coexistence of these perspectives created a complex legacy. Anthony was both a stabilizing force and an enforcer of discipline, admired and dreaded in equal measure. Memory of him persisted through personal anecdotes. Former associates recounted moments of guidance, strategic insight, or quiet intervention that had prevented escalation or loss. Neighbors recalled subtle forms of protection, spaces that had been kept safe, corners that were respected. Even those who had feared him acknowledged his awareness, his attention to detail, and the discipline with which he operated. These memories were selective, often incomplete, and filtered through personal experience, yet they shaped the collective impression of his influence. In parallel, rumors and mythology developed, extending beyond the immediate circles that had known him. Stories circulated about acts of decisiveness or reputation-enhancing strategies, some accurate, others distorted. These tales spread because the human imagination often amplifies what is extraordinary and compresses what is mundane. Anthony's legacy, in this sense, was partially constructed by the very social mechanisms that had enabled his rise: perception, anticipation, and the careful management of reputation. Fear had been both practical and performative, and after his absence, performative elements often outlived factual ones. The criminal justice system further codified his legacy in records, trials, and sentences. Legal proceedings documented specific actions and outcomes, stripping anecdote of embellishment. These records were public, yet sterile, presenting a version of Anthony stripped of narrative nuance. Within the system, he became a case study rather than a character. Evidence, testimony, and precedent replaced instinct and charisma. Outside, in the streets, the myth persisted, often intersecting awkwardly with the factual record. The duality of these legacies, public documentation versus lived experience, created a tension in how his story would be remembered. Communities adapted, and Anthony's absence left room for reflection. People assessed the costs and benefits of his influence with the benefit of hindsight. Some recognized the protective aspects of his presence, others remembered the price paid in constant vigilance, intimidation, and restricted freedom. These assessments were shaped not only by personal experience but by shifting conditions after he was no longer active. The evaluation of his legacy was therefore dynamic, evolving with time, context, and the ongoing recalibration of local power structures. Psychologically, his legacy influenced behavior even without direct intervention. Residents internalized lessons learned under his authority, which conflicts were worth avoiding, which interactions demanded caution, and how to navigate networks of loyalty and risk. These behavioral norms persisted, creating continuity even in his absence. Anthony's influence, once exercised through direct control, continued indirectly through patterns established during his time in power. His presence had taught people how to anticipate, negotiate, and survive, and these lessons became embedded in the social fabric. The mythos surrounding him also served as a cautionary tale. Stories emphasized both the benefits of strategic discipline and the dangers inherent in a world governed by fear and scarcity. Young men entering the environment were often told his name as a marker of consequence, a benchmark for understanding the balance between authority and risk. In this way, Anthony Jones' legacy operated as a living lesson, a narrative embedded in both memory and social instruction, extending influence beyond the temporal limits of his active life. However, legacy was not static. Over time, memory faded, replaced by new actors and new stories. Corners once controlled shifted hands repeatedly, and influence was redistributed. The immediacy of fear diminished with distance. Yet, fragments remained, anecdotes, warnings, and occasional interventions remembered by those who had experienced them directly. Even as circumstances evolved, these remnants provided context, shaping the way people interpreted both history and present-day interactions. In reflecting on his legacy, one observes the complex interplay of power, fear, and social perception. Anthony Jones exemplified the duality inherent in influence built on intimidation and reputation. His authority provided structure in an otherwise chaotic environment, yet it demanded constant reinforcement and carried costs both personal and communal. The streets, resilient and adaptive, absorbed his methods even as they outlasted his direct presence. His story demonstrated that individual power, while formidable, exists within broader systems that endure beyond any single actor. Ultimately, Anthony Jones' legacy is multifaceted. It exists in memory, in cautionary tales, in anecdotal accounts of protection and discipline, and in the residual social structures shaped during his time in power. It is a legacy defined by contrast, fear and respect, stability and danger, myth and reality. People remember him as both a figure of authority and a product of his environment. His story illustrates that the impact of influence is measured not only by immediate outcomes, but by the enduring patterns it leaves behind, shaping communities, behaviors, and perceptions long after the individual has stepped away. His legacy, therefore, is not contained in headlines or records alone. It lives in the streets, in the quiet recalibrations of human behavior, and in the memory of those who navigated the space he once controlled. It is a reminder that power is both temporal and persistent, fragile and enduring, and that the echoes of a person's influence often extend far beyond their immediate presence, resonating in ways both visible and unseen. The name Anthony Jones continues to exist not merely as a historical fact, but as a complex symbol, a reflection of the dual nature of authority, and a testament to the intricate, often contradictory legacy of power on the streets. The stories that surround figures like Anthony Jones often straddle a delicate line between myth and reality. Over time, accounts become exaggerated, embellished, or selectively remembered, emphasizing feats of power while obscuring nuance. Street legends thrive on fear, awe, and rumor, transforming complex human behavior into simplified narratives. In Anthony's case, the mythology that developed both amplified and distorted his presence, creating an image that was larger than life yet incomplete. Understanding his story requires untangling these layers, separating fact from embellishment, and confronting the realities that the myths often leave unexamined. One of the most persistent distortions involves the scale of his influence. Stories circulated that painted him as omnipresent, commanding entire neighborhoods with effortless authority. These accounts often ignore the operational constraints he faced, the reliance on intermediaries, the vulnerability to betrayal, the unpredictability of rivals, and the limitations imposed by law enforcement attention. In reality, his power was significant but bounded. Influence required careful maintenance, and his control over territory and associates depended on constant observation and strategic decision-making. The myth exaggerates what in truth was a careful, labor-intensive system rather than an omnipotent dominion. Violence, too, was subject to narrative inflation. Legends often present Anthony as merciless and relentless, someone who met every slight or challenge with immediate retaliation. The reality is more measured. Violence was employed strategically, as a tool to maintain order, reinforce boundaries, and shape behavior. It was not indiscriminate or impulsive. Many stories omit this nuance, portraying action as instinctive rather than deliberate. Understanding his calculated approach is critical. It reframes Anthony not as a caricature of brutality, but as a strategist operating within a high-risk, high-stakes environment. Another element frequently distorted is the perception of loyalty. Street lore sometimes suggests absolute fidelity from his associates, implying that fear ensured unwavering obedience. In truth, relationships were conditional, pragmatic, and continuously negotiated. Trust had to be earned and maintained. Betrayal was an ever-present threat, anticipated and managed through compartmentalization, observation, and selective disclosure. By ignoring these complexities, popular narratives obscure the precariousness inherent in the system Anthony navigated. The mythology simplifies human behavior into binary categories, loyalty or treachery, when in reality, it existed along a spectrum, influenced by circumstance, opportunity, and self-preservation. The role of law enforcement is often underrepresented in stories that surround him. Many myths emphasize street dominance while minimizing the persistent external pressures that shape decisions and constrained action. Surveillance, investigations, arrests, and the long game of legal strategy all played decisive roles in altering dynamics. Anthony's ability to adapt to these pressures demonstrates skill and awareness, yet myths often frame outcomes solely in terms of confrontation or personal prowess, ignoring the structural realities that influenced the flow of events. This omission perpetuates the illusion that his story was self-contained, when in fact it unfolded within a complex ecosystem of enforcement, social norms, and institutional intervention. Economic dynamics are similarly simplified. Narratives frequently focus on visible transactions, displays of wealth, or territorial expansion, presenting a sense of abundance and omnipotence. In practice, the drug economy that underpinned his influence was highly volatile, dependent on supply, demand, timing, and negotiation. Mistakes could be costly. Opportunities could vanish quickly. Anthony's skill lay not in sheer accumulation, but in the management of these variables, balancing risk against reward, maintaining cohesion among associates, and sustaining influence in a precarious system. Myth often overlooks this procedural and strategic dimension, substituting drama for accuracy. The personal costs of power are another aspect frequently elided. Mythologized accounts rarely address isolation, anxiety, and the psychological toll of constant vigilance. Maintaining authority required emotional suppression, calculation, and a relentless focus on potential threats. Sleep, relationships, and even identity were shaped by these pressures. The myths glorify outcomes while neglecting the internal burden, leaving a skewed impression of what leadership in such a context entails. Anthony's experience demonstrates that power, even when successful, exacts a sustained personal cost that is often invisible to observers. The human consequences for those around him are also understated in popular narratives. Stories often reduce others to plot devices, loyal associates, fearful rivals, or victims, rather than acknowledging the lived experiences of complex individuals. Families, friends, and community members navigated danger, opportunity, and survival within the same environment, their lives shaped by both Anthony's presence and the broader systemic pressures of poverty, neglect, and substance epidemics. Mythologized accounts frequently erase these dimensions, presenting a narrative centered on a single figure at the expense of the social context that defined the stakes. Time further complicates perception. As stories are retold, embellishment becomes inevitable. Actions are magnified, events compressed, and motivations simplified. Anecdotes that began as small demonstrations of control are recast as legendary feats. Fear is heightened in retelling, uncertainty becomes inevitability, and nuance fades. Listeners, removed from immediate context, often accept these narratives uncritically, internalizing simplified versions of complex social dynamics. The myth, once entrenched, persists even as the factual record becomes accessible. Reconciling myth with reality requires attention to context. Anthony's story was shaped by geography, socioeconomic conditions, policing patterns, and peer networks. His decisions, strategies, and behaviors existed within these constraints, not outside them. Acknowledging these factors does not diminish his agency or skill, but it does situate them accurately. Understanding the interplay between individual choice and structural conditions allows for a more complete picture of influence, risk, and consequence. The persistence of myth alongside reality also affects legacy. Public perception often prioritizes narrative impact over factual nuance. Stories of decisive action, fear, and dominance resonate emotionally, creating memory that is dramatic and compelling. Reality, with its uncertainty, compromise, and conditional success, is less narratively satisfying but more instructive. Anthony's life illustrates how myth can both illuminate and obscure, amplifying certain truths while concealing others. Ultimately, the exercise of separating myth from reality reveals a more balanced understanding of Anthony Jones. He was neither omnipotent nor entirely ruthless, neither universally admired nor universally feared. His influence was strategic, contextual, and contingent. It operated within a system of social, economic, and institutional pressures that both enabled and constrained action. Fear was a tool, not an identity, loyalty was conditional, not absolute, reputation was a mechanism of survival, not a guarantee of omnipotence. Recognizing these realities does not diminish the story, it enriches it, providing insight into the mechanics of influence, the complexity of human behavior, and the fragility of power when it rests on perception as much as action. The stories that endure are therefore twofold, one mythical, amplified by retelling and the human appetite for drama, the other factual, grounded in observation, context, and consequence. Both exist simultaneously, shaping how Anthony Jones is remembered, discussed, and understood. Engaging with both narratives provides a deeper comprehension of the stakes, the challenges, and the enduring lessons embedded in his life, illustrating the subtle interplay between legend and truth, fear and strategy, and the enduring complexity of influence in environments defined by scarcity, risk, and survival. As the city of Washington, D.C., settled into its usual rhythms, long after Anthony Jones' direct influence had diminished, the streets continued their relentless pulse, indifferent to individual triumphs or falls. Power, once concentrated and palpable in his presence, had diffused and adapted, flowing into new hands, reorganizing around emerging players, and evolving into structures that were resilient to the absence of any single figure. The legacies of dominance, fear, and control persisted in the behaviors, stories, and psychological patterns left behind, but the city itself remained constant, an ecosystem that endured independently, absorbing shifts in leadership with efficiency that Anthony could neither command nor predict. This final reflection is an exploration not just of a man, but of the forces that shape power, the consequences of influence, and the impermanence of control within a complex, adaptive system. Anthony Jones' journey from neighborhood observer to a central figure of authority demonstrates the fragile, conditional nature of street power. Unlike political or institutional authority, which operates within codified rules and enduring structures, the kind of influence he wielded was heavily contingent on perception, reputation, and the anticipation of consequences. On the streets, Power is never static, it is constantly negotiated through interactions, reinforced by compliance, and challenged by opportunism. Authority, in this sense, is as much a social construct as a personal achievement. Anthony's presence altered behaviors, expectations, and routines, yet this influence was inherently temporal, tethered to his ability to monitor, anticipate, and intervene effectively. When removed from direct participation, as occurred with his arrest and incarceration, the structures he had influenced did not collapse, they adapted, redistributed, and evolved, demonstrating that systems are often more resilient than the individual figures who inhabit them. The streets, in absorbing his absence, revealed the complexity and adaptability of informal systems of governance. Territories, alliances, and hierarchies did not remain vacant, they were contested and reallocated. Individuals who had once operated at the margins seized opportunities to consolidate power. Rival factions recalibrated strategies, negotiated temporary truces, and tested boundaries previously respected under Anthony's oversight. The social ecosystem of the streets, defined by scarcity, risk, and survival imperatives, demanded continuity. Structures persisted not through nostalgia or reverence, but because human behavior organizes itself around predictability, reciprocity, and the management of threat. Anthony's legacy became a reference point, a framework for understanding how authority could be exercised, but it did not dictate the next generation's actions. One of the most compelling aspects of his legacy is the duality in which it existed. To some, he remained a figure of order, a stabilizing presence whose interventions, though often rooted in fear, provided predictability within a chaotic environment. For others, he was a reminder of constraint, a figure whose power imposed vigilance, curtailed freedom, and demanded constant attention to social cues. This duality underscores a central truth about influence: it is experienced subjectively, interpreted through personal lens, and mediated by individual stakes. The same actions can be protective, threatening, or coercive depending on perspective. Anthony's authority was therefore inherently ambivalent, effective and formidable, yet emotionally and socially costly. Beyond the immediate perception of his power lies the broader consideration of fear as a social instrument. Fear, in Anthony's world, was both currency and tool. It organized behavior, reinforced compliance, and structured interactions without requiring constant intervention. However, fear is inherently unstable, it diminishes over time if not actively reinforced, is subject to reinterpretation, and can provoke resistance when over-applied. Anthony understood these dynamics instinctively, calibrating responses to balance authority with sustainability. Yet, the very mechanisms that enabled his rise, fear, reputation, and a careful management of perception, also contained the seeds of impermanence. When he was removed from direct influence, fear persisted temporarily but gradually diffused, making room for new actors to define the social landscape on their own terms. Parallel to this, the mythologization of Anthony's life reflects the human tendency to simplify complex social systems into narratives of heroism, villainy, or inevitability. Stories of decisiveness, omnipresence, and dominance circulated widely, often amplifying feats and compressing nuance. While these narratives contribute to his enduring presence in memory, they obscure the meticulous strategy, restraint, and constant vigilance that defined his actual practices. Separating myth from reality reveals the remarkable skill required to navigate such an environment, the constant mental load of managing both perception and consequence, and the personal cost of maintaining influence in a space where loyalty is conditional, and risk is omnipresent. The consequences of power, especially when maintained through fear, extended beyond Anthony himself. Associates, neighbors, and entire communities adjusted behavior in response to his presence. Survival, compliance, and adaptation became embedded in daily routines. Young men entering the environment learned lessons indirectly: how to navigate conflict, how to manage visibility, and how to anticipate the consequences of action and inaction. Anthony's influence, though tied to his physical presence and direct control, created patterns that persisted even after his removal. In this sense, legacy is not only the memory of the individual but the residual behavioral imprint left on a system, an imprint that shapes choices, perceptions, and social norms for years beyond the immediate moment. At the same time, legacy is inseparable from loss and cost. Anthony's personal experience demonstrates that power is never without sacrifice.